lived from 2006 to 2010, and she made this chicken salad in her own kitchen, and she sold it to the neighbors right out of her kitchen. And this spread to people at the Mises Institute. We were all eating her chicken salad. And a lot of chicken salad in town, like it's way too much mayonnaise, and you got to hire a private detective to find the chicken, and it's not good. Can you watch that, please? Thank you. So all the same, we became addicted to this chicken salad. I mean, we were eating it in sandwiches. We were eating it on crackers. We were eating it, with our bare hands right out of the container, basically. And then one day she got a note from the health department saying she was not allowed to do this. She cannot sell chicken salad out of her home if she's not a commercial establishment, because there are certain regulations she would have to comply with. So we, at the Mises Institute, those of us who were addicted to the chicken salad, we went berserk. I don't know what to do now, because that was the happiest thing in my life, and it's gone. So she ended up deciding that she was going to start her own restaurant, because that way it didn't matter what the health department said, because now she does have a commercial establishment. So it kind of pushed her into doing what she was leaning into thinking about doing already. And in fact, there was at least 1 or 2 blog posts on Mises.org of us expressing our outrage. And of course, it was principled outrage, but it was also withdrawal. Chicken salad withdrawal was talking through those blog posts. So we ended up getting what we wanted. But what's particularly interesting is at every single one of her 300+ locations throughout the Southeast, when you walk in, she has her story posted on the wall, and it includes mention of the Mises Institute. The Mises Institute is mentioned in every single chicken salad chick location, because we stuck up for her at a time when presumably one of her competitors ratted her out. So there you go, right? Isn't that a neat little Mises Institute story? There you go, yeah. It's a great story. And the other thing before I get started is that a couple of days ago, it's a long story, but I got my car detailed here in town, and it's supposed to be a mobile thing, but his truck wasn't working. It was a long story, so I had to bring it to him. So I had to take an Uber 2 days ago from Mises downtown. And the Uber driver picked me up and said, "What is this place? I drive by it all the time." And I said to him, "I consider it the most important building in the world." And that got his attention. Like, what? I mean, like right here in my town, the most important building in the world is right here in my town? So I had 8 minutes to talk to him about Austrian economics. And he was so interested and intrigued and moved that when we got there and I got out, he said, "I have to get out and shake your hand." He was about to shake my hand. He said, "No, I got to give you a hug." A hug over Austrian economics, ladies and gentlemen. So I think my talents are being underutilized. All right, now I'm ready, okay? Now we'll go. All right, so today I'm going to talk about a topic that more or less everybody associates with me now or expects me to talk about, and it is the topic of a book I never thought I would write, because I thought I was out of the book writing world as of 2014, because it's hard to write books and it's exhausting, and I just didn't feel like doing it. I thought I have nothing more to prove. I've already written a dozen of them. I don't need to do any more. But doggone it, this thing was so hideous, I couldn't not write it. So it's called Diary of a Psychosis. And this style with the black background, the white typewriter, and it's like a 1950s typewriter, like somebody was typing up your mental health diagnosis in an asylum somewhere. It looks like that. That was my idea. I said, that's what I want this cover to look like. And the idea of the book is not that I'm going to have a chapter on what lockdowns did, or a chapter on masks, and a chapter on vaccines, or anything. That's not how it's organized. It is organized, in effect, like a diary, so that you recall, or for people reading it well into the future, hear about for the first time what it was like, the texture of life during those years. Not just a sanitized, well, they did this, then this, then this, and it had this result. It's kind of as it's happening. Well, now they're doing this, and now they're saying that. And here's the opposite of what they said the other day, and they're putting that forward with a straight face. And here's a chart that tells you the opposite story of what they're telling us. And so it preserves maybe some of the oddball details that you would tend to forget in a general survey. But I didn't forget because I was writing about this like a fanatic on a daily basis for years because I was very interested in this subject because it affected me directly and it affected many people who were in much more vulnerable positions than I was directly, and many people were suffering for no good reason, and I just couldn't see how it was possible not to write about this or how it was possible for me to write my regular email newsletter about a topic other than this. This is the huge topic of the day. We have to discuss it. There's so much involved here. There's the corruption of this institution, corruption of that institution. There's the state and coercion. I mean, there's so much to talk about here. And I will say there were other, look, I'm not trying to start a fight here, but there were other libertarian institutions, let's say, that would publish articles like the problem with civil asset forfeiture. Now look, I yield to no one in my opposition to civil asset forfeiture. But in June 2020, that ain't the time. You know, like there are huge fish to be fried here, and that ain't one of them. So I did this. Now, we all remember the origins of this, and I'm fortunate that I lived in Florida during this time because my kids' lives were mostly normal. But not entirely, because we did travel and they would see how odd things were, and they would hear the news. And I had to make sure and explain to them, this is not normal. I don't want you growing up thinking if they try this again, oh, I remember when they did that before. Yeah, I guess we do that every once in a while. No, we don't. No, we don't. So they all have a copy of the book, all 5 of my daughters. They all have a signed copy of the book from Dad. So we remember, or at least I remember very distinctly, late 2019, reading the headlines that this novel virus, SARS-CoV-2, has appeared in China, and it's gradually beginning to spread around the world. So I thought, I'll keep an eye on that. I don't know, who knows what will come of that. Nobody exactly knew how the governments of the world were going to react to that. But early on, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who was director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, was telling people that you shouldn't go around wearing a mask. That's silly, and there's no reason for that. And that younger people in particular should continue to feel free to travel on cruise lines, carry on with their lives more or less as normal. Well, obviously we remember that didn't last particularly long. Before we knew it, everything was being shut down. So culture and the arts were just shuttered. People, other than those who were deemed to have quote-unquote essential jobs, were ordered to stay in their homes. And as we know, some countries enforced that requirement with more savagery than others. But everything, gyms, restaurants, schools, retail stores, everything closed down, although restaurants would serve you food to go and stores selling necessities remained open. If you had to be in public, you had to observe so-called social distancing. So you keep 6 feet between yourself and another person. They, of course, as you know, they later admitted that 6-foot rule was arbitrary, but they had to say something, so they said 6 feet. And so by complying with these and a considerable array of other requirements, we could thereby, quote unquote, flatten the curve. And I hate recalling all this dumb propaganda, flatten the curve. Yeah. So I hope some of you are familiar with the term midwit. A midwit is not a stupid person. A midwit is somebody with an IQ of about maybe 98 to 105. So somebody who's good at like regurgitating what the teacher says, like that's a midwit. Not like an outright moron and not a genius, a midwit. So what happened was a lot of the folks, let's say, on one side of the bell curve, were saying, well, these requirements all seem kind of dumb. And then we'd get to the midwit population. Well, you see, we have to flatten the curve, which means we spread the infections out so as not to overrun the hospitals. Yeah, I know. I've heard that from every official outlet for the past 2 weeks in a row. And they think if they just repeat it to me, then I'll go along. But I've already heard it, So people on the other side of the bell curve are saying, yeah, this is all pretty stupid. Like this, I have a funny feeling this is pretty stupid, and I have a really good sense that I'm going to be vindicated on this. Well, 15 days to slow the spread then became the public health slogan, but that public health emergency would be officially in effect for over 3 years. And so during that time, if you questioned any of these policies, if you said that their basis in science was dubious, if you noted the horrendous and widespread collateral damage, well, you were demonized, your voice was suppressed, you were accused of being callous with respect to human life. Well, several months ago, I spoke at a Mises Institute event in Arizona, and that event was about bureaucracy. So I thought I would reread Mises' 1944 book, Bureaucracy, and apply some of Mises' insights about it to the public health. Oh, whoa, whoa, whoa. No, 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 no. Go back, go back, go back. No, no, no. Whoop, no. Back, back, back. Oh, sorry, that was for the people in the booth. How do I do this? Oh, do I have to use the thing? Okay, there's a button, turns out. Turns out there's a button. It's got an arrow on it. It says back. Okay, all right. So Mises says, hold on, let me have a drink of water here. I gotta boost myself back up here. I don't do the things that Scott Horton does to stay alert. I just drink water. All right. Bureaucracies, as we know, Mises says, they're rigid and they prioritize compliance with the rules over adapting to new information. So Mises explains why that is so. I'm simply telling you that it is so. Bureaucracies always are looking to expand their scope and justify their existence. They often exaggerate problems or create new ones to maintain their relevance and power. Now that sounds familiar enough, I think. Mises said this: the bureaucrat's opportunity to derive profit from his activities is much greater than that of the average citizen. Every expansion of government activities increases his chances for promotion and power. All right, so inflexibility, an obsession with rule following, and grasping for more power. That sounds a teensy-weensy bit like what went on with the public health establishment during COVID. I will never forget how angry Anthony Fauci was that a federal judge had said that you don't have to wear masks on airplanes anymore. He was so angry. He said, this is a matter for public health to decide, not the Justice Department. So think about what he's saying. He's basically saying public health should be superior to the legal system, and we ought to be able to make decisions that no one can challenge. That's grasping for more power. Mises is thinking of Anthony Fauci in that description. But probably the most significant bureaucratic offense was the nonstop spread of propaganda, even while at the same time it had the nerve to accuse other people of spreading misinformation. Mises said, propaganda is one of the worst evils of bureaucracy and socialism. Propaganda is always the propaganda of lies, fallacies, and superstitions. Indeed. And were we ever subjected to propaganda? In particular, we were subjected to this moralizing narrative that said that people and places that obey the so-called public health guidelines, so lockdowns, masks, capacity restrictions, and so on, they're going to have relatively good results, but the stupid and selfish science haters who disregard the guidelines are going to get what's coming to them. Well, this story the regime fed us does not survive a glance at the charts. And I brought some with me. I brought some charts with me. So it was obvious from the very early contact tracing study in Iceland in the winter of 2020 that schools were no danger, and studies involving Google mobility data were finding no connection between health outcomes and mobility versus staying at home. But we'll start with a couple of outstanding examples. Now, I'm gonna use this screen in just a moment to share some of my charts. I didn't make the charts, but I found them, and I know the people who did, and like Ian Miller, for example, in California, was an absolute hero through this, and I do want to share some of these with you. And I compiled these particular ones. I have hundreds of them. I compiled these particular ones for a debate I was supposed to do at the Soho Forum in New York City, hosted by our friend Gene Epstein. Now, I debated Michael Malice, as you may know, on the subject of Alexander Hamilton 10 years ago. So if you type in Malice, Woods, Hamilton on YouTube, you're in for some real entertainment. But then after I beat him, and I beat him badly, let's just be honest about it. And I don't mean that I have this subjective sense that I beat him. These are Oxford-style debates where they poll the audience before and after. So you have an objective measure of the winner. And I'm telling you, I was the winner. Then I didn't do any more debating. And so Gene called me the Bobby Fischer of debating. Now, none of you are going to get that, but Bobby Fischer was the chess champion who didn't want to, who didn't want to defend his championship. He did come out of retirement finally, defended his championship, and then went back. But anyway, so I finally did do a debate, so I assembled these, and then the other debater didn't show up. But that was because he had a terrible personal tragedy, honest to goodness. So we still had the event. Like he had his opening statement, Gene read it, I read my opening statement, and then we had an evening of questions. But when I heard his opening statement, it was all fluff. There was a part of me that thought, maybe I overlooked something, and maybe I'm going to have the indignity of finding out just what I overlooked on a live stage being, live streamed all over the world. That doesn't sound particularly appealing. So I sat there with a legal pad ready to take notes as I sat in the audience listening to what would have been my debater's opening statement. And I was ready to take notes and get ready to respond. 3/4 of the way through, I unclicked my pen and said, this is not a problem. It was all fluff. And I thought, what could I have overlooked? I have all the evidence, I have all the charts, I have all the arguments. What could there be? Answer, nothing, apparently. Nothing. I couldn't believe it. But I didn't get a chance to debate the guy, unfortunately. But I'm going to share the slides with you guys. But first, let's start with 2 outstanding examples that don't require charts. And that is March 2020 through the first few months after that, and Sweden. Now, we all know, like we're all tired of hearing about it, that Sweden more or less proceeded as normal. But what some people don't realize is that they wound up having the best excess death numbers in Europe, like lower than anybody's. The best. They outperformed everyone. Now, if I had asked lockdowners in March 2020, suppose Sweden has such a laissez-faire policy that you people spend months at a time screaming at them at the top of your lungs, do you think they will wind up having the best results in all of Europe? They would have laughed at that, right? They would have laughed at it. But that's what happened. And yet, are any of them required to answer for this? Gee, I guess I had this as wrong as a person could possibly have anything wrong? No, of course not. And we don't have to speculate on what they would have said, because we can just look at what they did say. Sweden will be an example of what not to do. It's going to be a bloodbath, a killing field, whatever. All right, well, apparently these measures were not essential. If you could do that, and you just carry on and you have the best record of anybody. Now, if this were a normal country, that would have been all over the media. Would have been everywhere. Like, how could the expert class have gotten this so wrong? And it's not even like this is debatable. They said X and not X occurred. I mean, that's as cut and dried as it can be. But absolute silence. Now, you and I were urged to listen to the experts. Now, if you can utter the phrase, listen to the experts, without snickering today, you have a stronger stomach than I do. I certainly can. The experts had no idea what was going on either. That's the thing. They didn't have any idea what was going on. So, if you're afraid that you're going to blaspheme against our new priestly class, which adorns itself in lab coats and clipboards instead of the cassock and the beretta, by wondering if these measures did any good, well, rest assured, they had no idea what was going on either. One of my proudest things about the past 5 years is something I didn't even do myself, but there is a video, 2 or 3 minutes long, that one of our great libertarian creators, Dan Smots, created for me at diaryofcovid.com. And that is the best book promotion video I have ever seen. Made me want to go out and get it, and I wrote the thing. All I gave him was I said, you use your imagination how you want to do this. I just need you to make sure that a couple of particular clips make it into this video. And so, and by the way, so at that site, I also sell the book at cost. But even if you get it at the Mises Institute, still go to diaryofcovid.com because you can claim your bonuses. You get bonuses for getting the book. Get them at the website. Anyway, here's what I asked him to make sure went in that video. In early 2021, Andy Slavitt, which is a name that will ring bells only to people who follow this very closely, he was a White House COVID advisor. I mean, if there is a lower than low title you could have, I don't know what it is. But he was on MSNBC, of all places. MSNBC actually asked him a tough question for a change. Took them about a year, But eventually they asked a tough question, and they said, look, why are the numbers in California and Florida so similar when their policies are so different? I mean, according to you, shouldn't Florida be like a graveyard and California be a paradise? And here was his answer. And so I've captured this forever on the site in that video. Because he's probably thinking, well, nobody remembers this little clip from early 2021, but he is not counting on my fanaticism about this issue. So he said, there's so much of this virus that we think we understand and we think we can predict that's just a little beyond our explanation. So his answer is, I don't actually have an answer. We don't understand that either. But then he went on to say, but we all know what works, and then he listed all the policies that by his own admission, had not made any difference at all in these two states, even when you correct for the age difference between the states, which is a very important correction to make. So then somebody finally asked Anthony Fauci a similar question. They finally asked him. Took them about a year and a half. And they said, because he had said, if you obey me, you will get better results. Okay, so then Texas reopened, and there weren't corpses at the side of the road, so they asked Fauci, what do you think's going on there? And his answer, and again, this is at the site, this is in that video forever. He thinks, oh, people will forget that I said that. No, Woods is like an elephant in that way, you know. It's up here in the old noodle, and now it's in the video. His answer was, maybe they're doing things outdoors. Like they took all of Texas and brought it outside. Was the best he could come up with. You know, and I've said this before. I know that we have contempt for these people. But on some level, you know, like they're not stupid. Like the point, there are stupid people out there. These people aren't stupid per se. You know, maybe they're sinister. They could be a lot of things. They're not stupid. So you think to yourself, well, maybe if they were cornered with a question like this, maybe they have a very sophisticated response. Maybe they've got something to see with your own eyes and hear with your own ears that they have nothing is brutally refreshing. I don't know how else to describe that, but there it is. There it is. And again, suppose I had asked in March 2020, suppose California adopts these policies and Florida adopts those, what's going to happen? Well, of course, what we would have been told, Florida will be a bloodbath. But again, with the excess deaths thing, Florida ended up doing better than California. Ended up doing better. Now that's not possible, according to what we're told. That's not possible. But that's what happened. And yet, Ron DeSantis, you can criticize him on numerous grounds, but only a dope would have called him Death Santis, which is what they did. I lived in Florida. They called him Death Santis because of all the COVID deaths in Florida. And yet, he did better than California, and it's not like Death Newsom. You know, like, I mean, wouldn't even dawn on them to say that. Wouldn't even dawn on them. All right. What else do I want to say about this? All right, well, maybe we can start looking at some charts here. Now that I've whetted your appetite for some charts and I got the button all ready to go. All right, here comes chart number one. How about we plot the 25 most stringent states against the 25 least stringent states. So notice I have not indicated which one is which. I will in a second tell you which one is which, but in a way, does it really matter? Because they're essentially, for all intents and purposes, identical. Now, they shouldn't be, right? I mean, if you're going to disrupt people's lives and ruin their livelihoods and decimate their savings and compromise their health and all these other things that were done and destroy their dreams and everything, there damn well better be a pretty obvious difference in these two lines. Okay, so these are the most stringent states. So I just highlighted that. I mean, what, like that? We did it for this, like that? Now, how many Americans have seen a chart like that? Probably roughly the number of people who are in this room. Because I don't know if even Fox News showed charts like this, but that tells you a story. But I've got a bunch more of these. I got a whole bunch more. I mean, this settles it, in my opinion, but I'm a sport, you know? I'm a sport. I'll keep going anyway. Mises Institute asked me to speak for a certain amount of time. I said, okay. So right now we're looking at the 12 Midwestern states. And again, I have not indicated which one is which, because for this, it doesn't strictly matter. But I want to see if we can find Thanksgiving on the chart. Because remember, you weren't supposed to have Thanksgiving with people. Or if you did, you had to sit 3 states away and shout through a bullhorn or whatever. So we should be able to see some spike on this graph that would help us identify where Thanksgiving is. Now remember the wait 2 weeks thing. So there would be a gathering and we'd say, that's funny, the college football national championship just occurred and there's no result. And they'd say, well, you wait 2 weeks and then they'll get what's coming to them. I mean, these people were ghouls. They were ghouls. They'll get what's coming to them. And then 2 weeks would come and go and nothing would happen. But they're already on to the next thing. All right, so if it's true that you have to wait 2 weeks before you see the spike up, then maybe Thanksgiving is around here. Maybe like there, and then 2 weeks later you get the big spike. All right, let's see where Thanksgiving actually is. All right, that was my guess. That's where Thanksgiving is when the numbers are actually on the decline. And then 2 weeks later would have been about there. Christmas is not even on this graph. I mean, you don't see there's no indication that Christmas occurred. Now, was there anybody saying, doggone it, maybe we just don't understand what's going on here. Maybe we should show a little humility. Nothing about the guidance changed as a result of this. All right. I'm dying to go on. Let's go on to another one then. Why not? Mask mandate states versus no mandate. Now, given the absolute hysteria surrounding mask wearing, you would think there's going to be a huge difference between places that mandate masks and places that don't. And, there you go. And then, by the way, they all look like this. They all look like this. And when they don't, occasionally you get a little bit of variance. So we had some early research done by the CDC released, and it had to do with a couple of counties in Kansas that were contiguous, but that had different masking policies. And the county that did not require masks had a line that was higher than the one that did. And they said, well, there you go. And then they ended the study, or they ended the period that they were going to look at. Well, some of us have access to all the data, so we extended it out. And it turns out that the reason that they stopped it there was that a few days later, exactly the opposite trend occurs. But that's never mentioned. There was no follow-up. There was no nothing. So, it's not like they're just trying their best and they accidentally fall down on the job. Like, that's just a liar. That's just flat out. That's just a liar. All right. Here are a couple of states that I haven't labeled, but I'm going to tell you which states they are, but not which line is which. So we have here California and Nevada. Now, California, Nevada, and Arizona, if we were to trace all 3 of those, they had similar trajectories the entire time. And yet California was rigidly locked down. Nevada, a purple state, was more in the middle. And Arizona, of those 3, was the least locked down. And yet the curves were pretty much identical. So there's California, the blue, and there's Nevada, that was less locked down. So, we should be seeing very dramatic stories being told here that back up the narrative, but we just don't. The charts refuse to show them. Now, I want to say something about the state of Iowa. You may recall that the Washington Post called Iowa, quote, a state that doesn't care if you live or die. They're super fair, Washington Post. A state that doesn't care. Why did they say that about Iowa? Because Iowa got rid of, around February 2021, all the state level restrictions. And so, we know these restrictions have been working really, really awesomely well. So Iowa is going to be an absolute bloodbath. Okay. Well, that didn't happen. That did not happen. So Elaine Godfrey in The Atlantic wrote in November 2020, public health experts predicted another big surge after the holidays, but it never came. I went back to those experts to find out why. See, that's what's wrong with American society. I went back to those experts who predicted something that didn't happen. I went back to them for some insight. No, you go back to them for some apologies, and you go to the neglected people for the insights. All right, so she wrote a follow-up article called, because she figured out why it was that Iowa didn't have a big surge after all, after the holidays. And the answer was Iowans were scared into taking the virus seriously. She figured it out. She said the Iowa public health establishment scared the hell out of everybody. And therefore, everybody complied and stayed home, and then we kept the numbers down. The problem with that is that there were simultaneous declines just like Iowa's in a whole bunch of places that hadn't changed their messaging at all. So we're supposed to believe that the public health people in Iowa were so scary that they scared not just Iowa, but also North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota, Missouri, Illinois, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and Kansas. These are some scary SOBs, right? Hulk Hogan, may God rest his soul, has nothing on them. So they all had identical curves. So they also tried to claim that Iowa's November mask mandate had brought the numbers down. But again, this is special pleading. There were plenty of places that didn't have that mandate. They had the same decline. All right, so now Iowa, though, after February 2021, Iowa should really be an outlier among the Midwestern states, right? Its numbers must have shot through the roof. So here are various Midwestern states. That green line shows when the restrictions were lifted in Iowa. So which one of these is Iowa? Well, first of all, not really any of them is a particular outlier. Maybe that green one, but that's a really delayed outlier. There's Iowa, like right in the middle. Nothing particularly noteworthy about it. That's the state that doesn't care if you live or die. Was anyone apologized to in Iowa for having such a horrifying thing said about, well, these people? Apologies from these people? Forget it. Absolutely forget it. All right. How about, let's see what else I got up here. Let's just start going through them. Let's see what else I got up here. Germany and Sweden. All right. Very similar curves, but you can see the American media, like The Atlantic, trying its best to attribute the moves in Germany's numbers to masks and other interventions. But again, Sweden's getting the same numbers, and it's not doing those things, but Sweden just does not get mentioned. Now that's Poland. Now there's their mask mandate. And so what was happening in Western Europe and the United States was that would happen, and then you'd see it would be flat, and people would say, you see, if we weren't all such dum-dums in America, if we weren't all like King of the Hill, if we weren't all so stupid, we would have done what Poland did and what the Czech Republic did, because look at the results they get. And then this happens, and there's no follow-up report. There's nothing. Maybe we're oversimplifying this. Maybe we're making this into a cartoon. No mention. Czech Republic. Okay, Czech Republic has a life-saving lesson for America. Wear a face mask. Then the right-hand part of the graph occurs. No mention, no follow-up, nothing. So you might start to get the impression these people are misleading you, So then we would start to get, we never said masks alone would solve the problem. But the thing is, Robert Redfield, who was head of the CDC at the time, he was one of the experts we were told to trust. He said 6 to 8 weeks of mask wearing would do the trick. He said that. That's one of the experts we were supposed to follow. And the thing is, at the time, masks were getting credit for that flat line. So to then say, well, we didn't say masks would solve the problem, but you almost did. When we got these lines, you almost did say that. Practically did. All right, so I myself will admit to you that, what do I know about any of this? Like I'm not in medicine, but obviously you don't have to be in medicine to read a chart. Like they've got you thinking that you need a PhD or an MD in something to read a damn chart. No, you don't. I mean, some of these people got MDs. It's almost like they specialize in not reading charts or anti-reading them or something. But I thought, well, I don't know, maybe masks could work. What do I know? Maybe. So I never said go out there and wear one. I thought, well, I don't know, I guess we'll wait and see. I don't know. But I'm all about the data. And when these charts kept coming out showing no difference, I changed my mind. I said, no, I guess they don't matter. I guess they don't matter. The classic gold standard in all this is the Cochrane Review, which went through all the research there is, found no benefit to masking. The chief researcher on that project, his name is oddly enough Tom Jefferson, said, quote, "It is irrational to mask." Although, let me correct myself here. Somebody said there are two possible people who could have said that, but that was his thesis, was that it was irrational, it made no sense because there's no benefit. There's no benefit to it. Now remember, Bavaria and Berlin actually mandated what I call the suffocation mask, or the duck mask, makes you look like a duck. So when I would see people walking by with those, I would quack at them because I was just tired of all the compliance. And my wife would elbow me, but I'd go, quack, quack, as I would see these people. And I was lectured to. On Twitter by some libertarians who thought, well, it's voluntary. So, not every voluntary thing people do deserves respect. Just because you don't punch them in the face for it doesn't mean you have to respect it. You can chuckle. A free society also involves quacking when it's called for. Thank you, lone applauder. I appreciate that. So they mandated those masks in Germany. Okay, so you plot Germany against specifically Bavaria and Berlin, no difference. No difference. All right. Now, during this period, there was plenty of competition for the George Orwell Award, but making at least my personal top 10 is the American Academy of Pediatrics. Without so much as an acknowledgement of the European experience where toddlers were not masked, the AAP had a case of absolute toddler mask fanaticism to the extent that they systematically removed from their website any article that had ever said that toddlers need to see human faces as part of their development. That just disappeared. They weren't disproven. There were no substitute papers. They're just gone. So they used to have a page called FaceTime and Emotional Health. And it was a description of how adults can enrich infants as young as 4 or 5 months old. And it repeatedly refers to facial cues and expressions. Try to find that. It's gone. That's not normal. That's not normal. Now, everything that happened during these years was put through the moralizing filter. So in October, November 2020, Lakers and Dodgers fans were blamed for a spike in cases that occurred in LA County. But the same spike occurred at the same time in San Diego. And in case you don't know anything about California sports, I can assure you, people in San Diego were not out cheering for the Dodgers. The collateral effects on society of these radical interventions can probably never be fully calculated. And some of them, like the way friends were pitted against each other and friendships were destroyed, families were pitted against themselves, you can't even quantify them. In some countries, 2 years went by with no education of any kind for children. Not Zoom school, not nothing. 2 years of nothing. In Myanmar, we heard stories of people resorting to eating snakes and rats. What was done to Africa was a crime against humanity all its own. There's a book by a guy named Toby Green, who's a leftist, called The COVID Consensus. And he means that in a macabre sort of way. He's a leftist, but he says that the lockdown policies were crimes against the poor and vulnerable, which they obviously were. Kevin Bardosh did a full comprehensive review of the lockdown harms, and he concluded this: the promotion of lengthy social distancing restrictions by governments and scientific experts during the COVID crisis had severe consequences for hundreds of millions of people. Many original predictions are broadly supported by the cumulative research data presented above: a rise in non-COVID excess mortality, mental health deterioration, child abuse and domestic violence, widening global inequality, large increases in debt, food insecurity, lost educational opportunities, unhealthy lifestyle behaviors, etc. But then we have the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, arguing that the lockdown unemployment shock, so they're talking about the tens of millions of people who were suddenly thrown out of work, was projected to result in between 840,000 and 1.22 million excess deaths over the next 15 to 20 years. The New York Times even reported that because of the lockdowns, in the coming years, there would be 1.4 million excess tuberculosis deaths, 500,000 excess HIV deaths, and another 385,000 excess malaria deaths. Now, none of this neglect of collateral effects would have surprised Mises. Mises explained all the way back in 1944 that it was in the nature of bureaucracy itself to neglect collateral effects. and instead to focus obsessively on its area of immediate concern. So Mises wrote, governments encourage the specialists who limit their observations to a narrow field without bothering about the further consequences of a policy. The labor economist deals only with the immediate results of pro-labor policies. The farm economist only with the rise of agricultural prices. Today, in most countries, each department follows its own course, working against the endeavors of the other departments. The Department of Labor aims at higher wage rates and at lower living costs. But since nobody's looking at the whole picture, the same administration's Department of Agriculture aims at higher food prices. And the Department of Commerce tries to raise domestic commodity prices by tariffs. One department fights against monopoly, but other departments are eager to bring about by tariffs, patents, and other means the conditions required for the building of monopolistic restraint. And each department refers to the expert opinion of those specialized in their respective fields. Well, during the COVID years, we heard a lot of state propaganda about social distancing and masks and why your kid couldn't go to the playground. But what we did not hear were the stories of people who suffered under these restrictions. And there are more of those than you can possibly believe. But you were shamed if you criticized the policies because it showed you allegedly didn't care about human life. But of course, it was those people who didn't care about it because there are a lot of things that come together to make human life possible. And if human life was about nothing other than simply preserving a heartbeat, then we could all live isolated, each one of us, in a windowless room and somebody slipping us cans of navy beans through a slot in the door. But that's not really what human life is. And not to mention, the things they did kill people. So there's nothing to be said for them at all. I used to get emails from people about these stories, telling me their stories, because I write an email newsletter. And these were people who had no one else to talk to because their families thought they were crazy, their friends wouldn't talk to them. So they wrote to me, a stranger who sent them email newsletters because they thought at least I would listen. At least somebody would listen. So I actually compiled, with their permission, I compiled some of their stories. And I put it in one of the bonuses at diaryofcovid.com is you get a free copy of the second book, which is called Collateral Damage. And they tell their stories. And yes, they would like to see justice, but at the very least, they just want to be heard, you know, and not accused of anything, but just heard. And I've got 2 minutes according to this clock, so here's how I'm gonna use them. It's very startling to hear policymakers ever admit mistakes. They generally don't. Why would they? But we've now started to hear some of them admit it. I'll share just one. The absolutely loathsome Francis Collins, who used to direct the National Institutes of Health, now directed by Jay Bhattacharya, who wrote the foreword to my book. Francis Collins said, as a guy living inside the Beltway, feeling a sense of crisis, trying to decide what to do in some situation room in the White House, we weren't really considering the consequences in communities that were not New York City or some other big city. If you're a public health person and you're trying to make a decision, you have this very narrow view of what the right decision is, and that is something that will save a life. It doesn't matter what else happens, so you attach infinite value to stopping the disease and saving a life. You attach zero value to whether this actually totally disrupts people's lives, ruins the economy, and has many kids kept out of school in a way that they never quite recovered. This is a public health mindset. And I think a lot of us involved in trying to make those recommendations had that mindset, and it was really unfortunate. It was another mistake we made. Well, thanks a lot for nothing, Francis Collins. Well, I'll conclude with this. The libertarian world, I would give it a C+ in how it handled this situation. This was our opportunity to shine. And I'll just say the Libertarian Party was an outright embarrassment during this period. Well, as long as mask wearing is voluntary, we should, that is all you have to say in the wake of this? Get out of town. But I can tell you something, the Mises Institute was solid. The Mises Institute held its events. Everything went on as normal. We're all still here. There were regulations in town that said any facility that is open to the public, there's a mask mandate. So at the Mises Institute, what did they do? They plastered over all the doors, not open to the public. So no masks. We had events, we had fellowship, we fought against this in all different ways, through activism, through scholarship, through videos, at a time when even some of our own people their own knees started to buckle. But one thing you can rely on is that the Mises Institute just ain't never going to buckle, and God bless it. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, I'll go ahead and get started because somebody shushed you guys. And this thing's saying 1:59, but now I feel awkward that you're all staring at me, so I'll go ahead and start. And actually, this is good because I wanted to, before we jump into the inflation discussion, the more important thing is karaoke. And so you might have seen on the schedule tomorrow, there's a karaoke thing that is one of the optional events. So if that's your cup of tea, I would recommend, we're going to be using YouTube like as the way to source the the videos and have the lyrics and whatnot. So if you have your go-to karaoke song, go ahead and find the exact version you want on YouTube, before tomorrow, and then the guy running, the machine, you can just go show him and he'll pull it up, right? So that would be my suggestion, because you don't want to get up there and be the wrong key or something. That would just be embarrassing, all right? So that's the karaoke announcement. So what we're talking about today for this session is what Henry Hazlitt knew and what you should know about inflation. So let me just, for a moment, talk about this book, Economics in One Lesson. So I know for me personally, I can say this without hyperbole, in terms of what I knew about economics before reading a particular book and what I knew after, this one book, that it's not that big, certainly changed my worldview more than any other book, more than anything Rothbard or Mises did. So to be clear, if I were to pick one book to say what formed my view the most, I suppose it would be Human Action in terms of the broader sense, but I'm saying the increment in terms of what did I understand about economics before and after, this one was the highest value add, if you want to use that terminology. And so I think that's probably true for a lot of people, because the special place that this book had. It was a bestseller. So let me just go through what I'm going to tell you today. I'm going to first explain who this Henry Hazlitt guy is in case he's not on your map. I'm going to give two definitions of inflation, and then I'm going to go through the presentation that Hazlitt gives in his chapter on inflation, where it's a naive confusion of money with wealth, redistribution of Cantillon effects, and the money illusion, real versus nominal wages. And finally, at the very end, so this first elements are going to be pretty standard introductory stuff, but then just as a little bonus for you overachievers, there is a part in this chapter. So I just reread it, before preparing this lecture, just to remind myself of exactly the presentation Hazlitt gives in his book. And there is a section that is possibly confusing or misleading. So if we have time at the end, I'll hit on that very quickly. Okay, so who is or was Henry Hazlitt? I would recommend, if you have the time, go look this up. So this is at Mises.org, that Bettina Greaves, she wrote this up as a sort of a memoriam to him. And he's a fascinating guy, born in the late 1800s. Among other things, he wrote for the Wall Street Journal, which may not surprise you, but he also wrote editorials for the New York Times on economic matters, and also for Newsweek. Okay, and so when you see what a free market, laissez-faire guy this is, he was instrumental when Mises first came over in getting him a job, because the academic community looked down their noses on Mises. So I'm saying Hazlitt is this bomb-throwing free marketeer guy, and yet there was a period in human history when he was the one that the New York Times had to have an editorial on some economic topic. He was the guy for a while, right? So that just kind of shows you how much things have changed. And then why he ended up losing his perch at some of these sort of mainstream establishment organizations, outlets in terms of economic commentary, was he was not a fan of the Bretton Woods monetary arrangement that was after World War II. And Bettina explains the story in this piece, and says, I forget how exactly it went, but it was sort of like he wrote something critical of the Bretton Woods arrangement, and then the superiors kind of told him, I forget the way they put it, but you can't be writing articles like that. And so he didn't write more on that, but then he found some other post somewhere, right? So he, in other words, didn't go against their wishes, but he realized, I can't stay here if I'm not allowed to speak my mind on this stuff. All right, so fascinating guy. Lots of connections with the Foundation for Economic Education. He was friends with all the main players, a lot of the names on this room that you would have heard of. But as far as this book, Economics in One Lesson, in case you haven't read it, the title, what does he mean? He just says right at the beginning that the difference between bad economics and good economics, or what makes someone an economist versus someone who's a hack, is that the economy, or the person who's falling for fallacies, the bad economist, or the person who's ignorant of economic science, just looks at the immediate impact of a policy and only on the obvious beneficiaries of it, whereas, the mark of a true economist is to not just look at the obvious beneficiaries of something, but also look at everybody in society to see, the impacts on them, and not just to focus on the short term, but also the long-term consequences. So that's what the one lesson is. And then, so he's got it, he says the lesson stated, and then the rest of the book he just calls like the lesson applied. And then he just has chapters like on price controls, minimum wage, tariffs, things like that, okay? So what I'm doing in today's talk is just summarizing what did he say in his chapter, I think it's called The Mirage of Inflation. Okay, before I get into the meat of what did Hazlitt cover in that chapter, what I'm gonna say here, I think Hazlitt elsewhere in the book talks about this distinction I'm gonna make, but he doesn't actually do it in this particular chapter, but I think it's important for me to explain it here. So forgive me, this is the longest thing I'll read for you guys, but it's important. So this is from Mises, who we're a fan of him here at the Institute. And he says, there is nowadays a very reprehensible, even dangerous semantic confusion that makes it extremely difficult for the non-expert to grasp the true state of affairs. Inflation, as this term was always used everywhere, and especially in this country, and so here he was giving a talk in the United States, means increasing the quantity of money and banknotes in circulation and the quantity of banknotes subject to check. But people today use the term inflation to refer to the phenomenon that is an inevitable consequence of inflation, that is, the tendency of all price and wage rates to rise. The result of this deplorable confusion is that there is no term left to signify the cause of this rise in prices and wages. There is no longer any word available to signify the phenomenon that has been, up till now, called inflation. It follows that nobody cares about inflation in the traditional sense of the term. As you cannot talk about something that has no name, you cannot fight it. Those who pretend to fight inflation are in fact only fighting what is the inevitable consequence of inflation, rising prices. Their ventures are doomed to failure because they do not attack the root of the evil. Okay, so, and this is interesting for him because Mises wrote what's translated as the theory of money and credit in 1912, and so like he's not here just repeating what some guy told him. Like he lived through this. He experienced this in his professional career to see that, yes, and he was a monetary theorist. It wasn't just that he was into economics, like he was one of the pioneers in monetary theory. And so Mises is just stressing, so I think this, I just read from you, I think was in the 50s or 60s, he gave a talk in the United States. But the point being that originally what inflation meant was inflating the money supply. And money either meaning like the actual, narrow like amount of notes that were the official currency, but also like bank loans could be added into there, right? So inflating that, one of the inevitable consequences, prices would go up, would tend to go up, in that currency. And so inflation, and so what I do in my work, just to try to avoid confusion, is I use just adjectives, like so I refer to monetary inflation and price inflation, or I might even say consumer price inflation to get real specific. Because you'll notice when people say, we're worried about inflation, nowadays they mean prices, and if they're complaining about it, they don't mean, I'm so mad that my stock portfolio's prices went up. That's not what they mean. They mean when I go to the grocery store and the eggs are more expensive, that kind of thing, all right? So Mises' point here is that this has been a semantic shift, and it's not just a harmless that, the British spell color with a U in it and we don't, big deal. That, no, he's saying that because of this shift now, when they say inflation, what do we do about it? If they mean rising prices, that's, taking attention away from the fact that the reason that's happening is because of the central bank. And so nowadays, you have this crazy outcome where the Federal Reserve officials will come out and talk about their plan to fight inflation, when definitionally they cause it according to the Misesian use of the term, and then even in the modern sense, it's like they're causing the very thing that they're then saying, we're really trying our best to get it under control, but man, this inflation is really tough to lick, right? So it's insane, but yet that's where we are. Okay, so what Hazlitt does in the beginning of this chapter is he starts going through, and what Hazlitt is very good at rhetorically is taking on the arguments of the people who are in favor of whatever bad policy he's going to critique in the chapter, whether he's talking about tariffs or minimum wage laws or whatever, rent control. Hazlitt's going to be against it. He's going to be for the free market, but he's very good at summarizing and saying the people who are proponents of this policy will say this, right? And then he just kind of step by step deals with like the crudest, most naive version of the argument And then, once he knocks that down in 2 seconds, then he'll say, oh, but then the more sophisticated advocate will say, da, 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 da. And then so it's kind of like a circle. So if you're not used to that rhetorical style, it might be a bit tricky to follow, but once you realize that's the approach he's taking, it's very comprehensive, and that's why I think it's so useful. And again, even though this book was written, Joe, is it like 1946? Does that sound right to you? Yeah, that's when it first came out. It's still, the language is a bit, like he's an adult, right? So if you're just a teenager or something, some of the language might be a little bit in terms of the examples he uses and so on. It might not be fully relevant to you. Like if you haven't had a house that you're paying a mortgage on, some of the stuff might just seem like, but other than that, it's still, like I highly recommend it in terms of just a standalone book to go through this stuff. But so anyway, so on this one, he starts out very simply and just says, some of the advocates of inflation, they're making the most simplistic mistake of conflating money with wealth, right? And so just very naively, everybody knows, oh, if I had twice as much money, right? If I had right now, I had $1,000. If I had $2,000, I would be wealthier. I would be able to go buy more stuff. I would feel richer. When you talk about how much am I worth, if we could just double that number by giving me more money, well, that would be great. All right, and then he says, but obviously that doesn't follow through for everybody. If we just double the total stock of money in the entire economy, it's not that we would all collectively be twice as wealthy. And why is that? And this is very simple, but let me just go ahead and say it in case you've never thought it through, that the reason that won't work is that just because there's twice as much money doesn't mean that there's twice as many cars, there's twice as many houses and so on, right? So any one individual, if that person had an extra $1 million in cash, let's say, like in the US, dollar bills, right? That would benefit that person. They would feel wealthier, they would be wealthier. They could go out and buy more stuff. But obviously, if you just gave an extra $1 million in paper Federal Reserve notes to every single person in the community, they couldn't all go out and buy mansions and sports cars and so on, because what would happen, they would just bid up the prices of those things. Then all of a sudden people would realize, oh wow, last Thursday having an extra $1 million in cash was a big deal, but now it's not, because now eggs are $100 a carton, right? So that's what would happen. And even though that's a very elementary thing to do, and maybe some of you thought of that when you were 8 years old, that's beyond where a lot of people are right now. When they advocate for just naive inflationism, that's the way they think. And so, Hazlitt spends some time knocking that down. And then also, too, if that were true, if it really were that simple, it would lead you to ask, well, how come there's still poverty? You know what I mean? Why haven't they printed money? And maybe you could say, well, because the elites in many places are really against that and whatever, they want to hoard it for themselves. But surely one government somewhere in human history would have just started printing money, and then other people would be billionaires, like in our sense of the term, and yet that hasn't happened, right? So that's the obvious explanation for that. Okay, so then he goes on and he says, now that I've walked you through just that very simplistic explanation of what's wrong with pure naive inflationism, where people are just, you know what? Let me say one other thing on that to make sure you're getting the argument why I said that it's conflating money with wealth. The one good for which what I just said is the case is money, right? With other goods, that's not the case. That if you said, oh yeah, somebody who has one house, he might think if you had two houses, he would be a lot wealthier. But if we gave everybody two houses, and that would be true. Everybody would be that much wealthier, right? In other words, if you gave more real goods, if you doubled or quintupled or multiplied by 100 how many apple trees we had, or how much farmland, or anything else that was a component of wealth, then it would work. It would scale. There wouldn't be what's called a fallacy of composition. That the same thing that would make one person wealthier, if you increased how many houses they had or how many sports cars they had, if you did that for the community as a whole, each individual, it would follow, right? And this is because you'd have more actual wealth. The one type of good where that doesn't work is when it comes to the money good. Okay, so just again, that's why there's something special there. That it's not wrong for an individual to include the units of money in the calculation of that person's net worth, right? When you want to say, like, how many assets does this person have? If you have a bunch of cash in a home safe, it's not wrong to include that, but there is just something subtle involved that, if you just add that up for the community as a whole, you got to be careful, especially if you're talking about fiat money, right? If it's like gold and silver coins, yeah, having more gold coins makes the community wealthier in a real sense, because you could melt the gold down and do something with it besides just being the money. But qua money, as in its role as the money unit, just increasing the stockpile doesn't actually make us wealthier, all right? And that's, again, that's very peculiar to money per se. And so if money's just a component of wealth, that's why you just gotta be careful. All right, so after he goes through all that, explains that subtlety, then he says, the situation's worse than that though, when it comes to standard arguments that are pro-inflationary, that you might think from the previous discussion that, doubling the stockpile of money is, it's not gonna help anything, right? It just means in the long run, prices will basically double, but you might think it's kind of a wash. So go ahead and do it, but just don't think anything good's gonna come out of it. It's just we're all gonna kind of tread water, and all the prices will double, but all the wage rates will double and everything. And then he says that that's actually not true either, because in reality, the new money comes in through a very specific process, okay? And then that shows, when you walk through the consequences of that, it shows that there's a redistribution. Okay, so to be clear, just use the example, doubling the stockpile of money that the community holds can't make everybody wealthier, right? Because again, you don't have more coal mines, you don't have more farmland and so on, but it's not that everyone magically is just indifferent, it's that some people are hurt and some people benefit. So there's a redistribution of wealth among sectors. And the sequence that he goes through, and that this is pretty standard in this kind of literature, is just a step-by-step that, let's say the government prints up money and uses it to buy tanks. Well, then the firms that make the tanks, hire the workers, and buy the raw materials to make the tanks, they're the original recipients of that new money. So they actually benefit from this process. And the way that he explains it, I think probably works in terms of just a logical step-by-step argument, is that you can imagine that prices only rise gradually as new money flows into those sectors. In reality, just on the side here, I'm saying to you, you could imagine something more sophisticated where people knowing of the policy, they might respond before the new money hits their area. But just in terms of thinking it through, if you haven't thought of this before, the baseline scenario, just think of it as a step-by-step process where you're in original equilibrium, people have a certain amount of cash, wage rates are a certain amount, prices are a certain amount, and then yes, the government just creates out of thin air a boatload of new money that they use to buy fighter jets or tanks or whatever. And so the firms selling those to the government, they have higher sales, then they can give dividends to their shareholders. Those people really are wealthier because there's a sense in which they go out into the community armed with all this newly printed money, and prices are basically the same as they were the day before. So they can buy things, and then it just step by step goes through the community. So Hazlitt does it like he's got A, B, C, D in terms of like segments of the community. And he's saying the people in segment A benefit from the inflation because they get the new money early on. The people in B benefit, but not as much, because now when the people in B, who are like the people who sell the luxury goods to the shareholders of the defense industry, okay? So by the time those industries see their demand for their products go up, prices in general, like the steel or whatever that went into the tanks, is now more expensive than it was before the inflation started, right? So they're already, getting the money a little bit late in the game, and so prices already are higher, but still they benefit on net. And then the idea is the people then in Group C, by the time they get it, they're the people that the next round go and spend their money on. Then, they've been seeing prices going up step by step while their income has been the same in money terms. And then you see how it goes. And then finally, the poor people in Group D, who are the last recipients, all along, they've seen prices going up in pockets here and there, while how they get their income has stayed the same in money terms. So they're losing throughout all that because now they can't buy as much at the store. And then finally, when their wages respond, or however it is they get their income, at that point, they're just catching up, right? So they're finally just being made whole in terms of the levels compared to the original equilibrium, but all throughout that process, they've been behind, okay? So that's the sense, and he's just showing mechanically how to think about it, like one particular iteration of that sequence where you can see how that redistribution would happen. So again, when the dust settles, as a first approximation, you can say, yeah, doubling the quantity of money isn't going to make society, isn't going to raise per capita income. It's just going to kind of double everything, all the prices. And that's basically, that's a decent first approximation, but that hides the fact that there's a lot of redistribution throughout that process. So that's called Cantillon effects. Just, I'm sure you may have heard that term, but that's what that refers to, that was the economist who first really spelled that out, that process. Let me mention, in terms of the Austrian theory of the business cycle, one way that you can think about it is that Mises, when he's explaining what causes the boom-bust cycle in a market economy, is the specific application of what happens if the new money that's entering the system comes in via the loan market. All right, so the example I just did there was, what if the way the new money comes in is that the government prints it up, or it can be electronic, and then they start buying tanks with it, right? I just walked you through there. But then another issue would be, okay, what if the way the new money gets in the system is that the banks engage in fractional reserve banking, and so there's a sense in which when they make loans, that increases the quantity of money, and what if that's how the new money enters the system, is by banks loaning it into existence? Okay, and then so that has its consequences, but so if you think about there, what happens is the disturbance originally comes in when the rate of interest gets pushed down, and it doesn't, the full rippling effects of that new money haven't yet worked their way through the system. And so there's very particular consequences if the first stage of that new money flowing in is from banks loaning it into existence. All right, so you could say that Mises' theory of the business cycle is one application of possible Cantillon effects of inflation coming in through that particular sector. All right, so I just want to make sure I'm not losing you. My point is, if you're just talking about generically the effects of inflation, it makes a difference if the government just were to print up money and just hand it out to people on a per capita basis. It would still have these effects that I'm talking about, because even if they gave it to everybody in terms of how much money you have right now, we'll just double it. Some people might go out and spend it, or some people might put it on their mattress. Or, So even there's no way to do it so it's just a perfect wash and all the prices just respond proportionally. But I'm saying it obviously matters the particular way it comes in, all right? So that's the theory of the business cycle that I know you heard earlier this week. You can fit it into this framework that way. Excuse me. Okay, so then Hazlitt rhetorically, he's going through, so he showed, just printing money just obviously can't make us all wealthier in a very naive sense. Then he says there are these redistribution effects. And then he says, okay, now the more sophisticated proponents of inflation will say that, if there's periods where there's massive unemployment or other idle resources, in that kind of a situation, inflation really can work, all right? So let me just show you, so again, he's being very clever and fair to his opponents by he's showing possible loopholes in the arguments he's making, up to that point in the chapter. So originally, if you think back when he said, hey, just printing up money can't possibly make us all wealthier because, hey, we're not making more coal mines, we're not making more oil deposits, farmland, and so on. He sort of implicitly was assuming there was what you could call full employment in the beginning, right? So if all the resources are fully employed, everyone's got a job, all the farmland's being used to grow the crops, blah, 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 and now we just double the quantity of money, how can that make more fruit production or oil production or whatever, cars rolling off the assembly line per period if we originally were fully employed, right? And so therefore, it seems obvious printing up money per se doesn't increase the flows of any of those real goods and services coming to market. So obviously we can't be better off in real terms. But then again, so now he's at this point in the chapter, he says, what if we originally started out in a depressed economy? Because this is now what some of the more sophisticated advocates of inflation say. Here, maybe by injecting more purchasing power and raising aggregate demand, we can jumpstart the economy. And that earlier argument we made about you can't make us wealthier in real terms just by printing money, well, maybe that is true if for some reason the economy was in a slump. That 10% of the workforce was just sitting home doing nothing. Maybe now printing money can suck them back into the workforce, and so therefore, that original critique doesn't work. All right, so that's the argument. And so he says, among other things, that this partly what this relies on is that for there to be this slump in the first place, this unused capacity or idle capacity, unemployed resources, there must be some mismatch in what he calls prices and costs, right? So all costs are prices too, and he knows that. He's just trying to be colloquial. So what he means is you're a business enterprise, and the amount that you can sell your goods and services to your own customers for, and then you look at, well, what are the costs of production for me to make those things? If there's some problem where, for whatever reason, the costs are so high and that what I can sell the finished product for is not high enough to meet that, well, I'm just going to stop, right? I'm not going to pay people $10 an hour for them to make something that I can only sell for $9. That's the issue, okay? And so Hazlitt is saying that what some of the advocates of inflation are claiming is that in a slump, what happens is the amount that the workers are demanding in terms of money wages is at a certain level, and that the prices aren't high enough to make that profitable, so they're not hired. And so why don't we just come up with a way that if we just print enough money that can raise the prices of the finished, the final goods, so now the firm will be willing to hire them. Okay, so that's the argument, and you can see if that were true, then that defeats that original objection, right? Then you can see, oh yeah, so the reason we really are wealthier, even in real terms, is because now the unemployment rate went from 10% down to 3%. So there's more people working, so that's why more physical stuff is getting produced. All right, so as I'm saying here, one point he makes is that even on its own terms, this is relying in a bit on deception. That if you're saying that the workers, because another way that this could be achieved, right, if the workers need $10 an hour, but what they're making is only, the firm can only sell for $9, then you could say, yeah, if you could somehow cause inflation and raise this to 11, then it would work. You'd pay them 10 and sell the product for 11. But by the same token, what if their wages could fall to 8? And then it would also work, right? And you don't need inflation to get their wages to fall. So what the proponents of inflation will say is, oh, the workers, they won't, for psychological reasons, for various other types of reasons, there's sticky wages, right? That's a phrase that gets thrown around, sticky. What's weird is in the 1920 and 21 depression, wages were not sticky. They fell quite rapidly, and that's why you didn't have a depression all through the 1920s. Whereas in the early 1930s, wages all of a sudden became sticky, all right? So that stickiness is not just a fact of nature or even a fact of the market economy. There were particular things the Hoover administration did in conjunction with labor unions that make wages sticky in the early 30s, all right? So there's that element. But even on its own terms, Hazlitt's saying it still involves deception, right? If the workers say we would not tolerate a wage cut, then you still are implicitly, lowering their real wages, their inflation-adjusted wages, if you're just raising prices, but the wage rate's staying the same, all right? So there's that element, and then beyond whether you think that's valid or not in terms of morality, he's saying just pragmatically that's not a long-term solution. That eventually the labor unions, particularly for well-organized workers, are going to realize what's happening, and then they're going to build in cost of living adjustment clauses into their contracts that say, if we were demanding a money wage rate of 10 when the average price level was 9, I'm just speaking loosely here, and then if prices go up to 11, well then you better raise our pay to 12, and so you're still going to have that mismatch. Okay, so those are the arguments that Hazlitt makes in this section. Let me just read something. I thought this was a funny paragraph that he had here. So he says, he's talking about this general phenomenon where there could be mismatches between certain costs of production and the finished goods, and the claim that, hey, if we just printed a bunch of money and threw it in the system, couldn't that allow for spikes in prices here and there that could kind of lubricate things and get the economy back on its feet? And so he says, true, inflation may sometimes correct them, meaning like these mismatches, but it is a heady and dangerous method. It makes its corrections not openly and honestly, but by the use of illusion. It is like getting people up an hour earlier only by making them believe that it is 8 o'clock when it is really 7. It is perhaps no mere coincidence that a world which has to resort to the deception of turning all its clocks ahead an hour in order to accomplish this result should be a world that has to resort to inflation to accomplish an analogous result in the economic sphere. Okay, so that's interesting. But the reason I thought that was like quaint and charming is, he was born in the late 1800s, so he lived through the imposition of what we call daylight savings time, right? Like that was really put in place in World War I in the United States, and then it kind of was rolled back, and then it came back in World War II, and I think it was in 1966 is when they, firmly established it was just a permanent thing. So I'm saying Hazlitt, could remember, back in my day, the time was actually the real time. We didn't just change all the clocks to get everyone to behave the way we wanted. And if you wanted everyone to get up an hour earlier to save energy or something, you would just say, hey, instead of waking up at 6 o'clock, why don't we wake up at 5? You wouldn't change the clocks. You know what I mean? Like, it'd be like if you wanted to promote, nutrition to have people be taller, if instead you just change the rulers instead of feeding people better or something, right? Like that's kind of what he's getting at there. So again, what I thought was cute about that is he's like lamenting, like, yeah, can you imagine the kind of society that changes the clocks? But to us, it was like, well, yeah, that's what we do. Twice a year, we change the clock, So just like, well, yeah, if the government needs more money, it just prints it. What's the big deal? There's no constraint. So anyway, I'm just saying it's funny that he's harking back to a time when, to him, that's just anathema. Okay, let me spend a bit of time just on this last part that's possibly confusing, and we go to 45 with this one, right? Okay, I'll probably have time for a question or two. Okay, so let me just go ahead and read this. He says, suppose the public works, so what he's doing, by the way, here, he's contrasting and saying how the government can't just create more prosperity, create more jobs just by spending money on something. And so at first he says, well, if it's just out of explicit taxation, it's crystal clear that the government's not going to be able to create jobs that way, right? Because if it's going to spend $1 billion here creating jobs in this area, it had to tax the money from somewhere else, and so the public can't spend the money over there, so jobs get destroyed over here, so on net. So that's kind of the argument he was making, and so now here he's coming he's going to first talk about borrowing the money, and then he's going to go on to talk about, well, what if they just printed it? All right, so the printing stuff we've already kind of covered, but here, just to round out this discussion, and again, since I'm pointing you guys to go read this, I didn't want any of you to possibly get an erroneous view here. Let me just explain this one little piece, and then we'll have time for a question or two. He says, suppose the public works are not paid for from the proceeds of taxation. Suppose they are paid for by deficit financing, that is, from the proceeds of government borrowing or from resort to the printing press. Then the result just described does not seem to take place. The public works seem to be created out of new purchasing power. You cannot say that the purchasing power has been taken away from the taxpayers. For the moment, the nation seems to have gotten something for nothing. Okay, so everyone see what he's doing there, that if the way Henry Hazlitt, originally said the government just spending money to create jobs over here, something's got to be wrong with that if they tax it. Okay, now, again, he's just trying to say, well, what if they say, well, they didn't tax that money, they just borrowed it. Okay, so he explains if they do it through borrowing, eventually they're going to have to start paying back the loan. They just can't keep having the debt grow, exponentially. At some point, they're going to have to start financing that debt. So once he establishes that, then now he says, and so now we can see the problem with this approach. Yet when the government comes to repay the debt it has accumulated for public works, it must necessarily tax more heavily than it spends. In this later period, therefore, it must necessarily destroy more jobs than it creates. The extra heavy taxation then required does not merely take away purchasing power, it also lowers or destroys incentives to production, and so reduces the total wealth and income of the country. Okay, so here, let me just explain what I don't want you to walk away thinking from this. It sounds like Hazlitt is saying, yes, it's true on the front end, if the government spends a bunch of money that it borrowed, it could create jobs, but don't think that that's a good idea, because then at some point down the road, they're going to have to run a surplus. They're going to have to tax more than they spend, down the road, and at that point, they'll be destroying jobs. So we're not gaining over the whole cycle, right? It sounds like that's what he's saying, and that's not correct, right? So that's what I want to, again, this is partly like kind of a high-level thing, just because I know some of this talk was pretty introductory. So here I just want to hit this esoteric point. I think what Hazlitt is doing here is just rhetorically, he's just trying to say, even if somebody thinks this makes sense, that by deficit spending you create jobs with no countervailing loss, that can't be right, because then down the road you would be, doing the opposite. So therefore, But in case you think he's saying this is really what would happen, that's what I want to clarify, that's not correct. And in particular, the reason I want to stress that is, suppose right now we did get a budget hawk, and suppose like the Doge stuff really went through and the government really did start running whatever, $300 billion annual surpluses for the next few years to try to start paying down the debt. It's not the case that we would have to have 12% unemployment because, as Hazlitt says here, when they do that, no, you'd still have full employment. In other words, it doesn't hurt the labor market for the government to run a budget surplus. Okay, so if you're saying like specifically what's the problem here, it's, again, I'm not sure if he was saying this literally or he just meant for the sake of argument, even if someone thought this is how the world works, blah, blah, blah. But the reason the world doesn't work this way is when the government is running a surplus, that money is still going back to the private sector, right? In other words, if they tax $1 trillion and they only spend $800 billion, so they're running a $200 billion surplus, what does that mean? The surplus, the people who have treasury debt, they're getting the $200 billion. That's what it means, okay? So that money is still flowing out of the government's hands, and I would say it'd be far better, given that the money's gonna come from taxation, go to Washington, and then go out to the community. I would say it's way better if what it's doing is retiring outstanding bonds, treasury bonds, rather than funding new government spending, right, in terms of buying goods and services or whatever, okay? So there's that element. So I'm saying that's the specific mechanical issue, even if they burned it, right? Just in general, forget government debt. Let's just say they taxed $1 trillion and they could spend it on stuff, or they could just burn half of it every year. I would recommend burning half of it every year, right? Because that would cause, the amount of money to shrink, and then that would cause prices to fall. So there'd be, the public would have, the money they retained would have higher purchasing power. Okay, so again, it's, you want to get away from the notion of that, at least if the government spends the money, it'll get back in the economy or it'll create jobs. You know what I mean? That's not the way to think about it. That if the government spends the money, then that causes those real resources to get sucked into whatever the government spends it on. Whereas if they just burn it, the real resources are not getting redirected into political uses, right? So prices and wages can adjust. That's maybe another way to think about it. Whatever the money stock is, after the initial shock and people understand what's going on, prices and wages can adjust so everybody can get a job. So it can't be that perpetually you'd have high unemployment because the government's running a surplus or something. That doesn't work, all right? So I just wanted to clarify that, and we've got 8 minutes left if people want to ask questions. And there's a guy with a mic back there.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I have a question. Many people say about the high cost inflation. Some say it's not due to expanding the money supply. It could be, for example, supply chain issues, labor shortages, or even some come like use that as an excuse to raise prices. And many people make these claims. What do you say to refute that or to fact check that? Okay,
sure. So the question, just in case you didn't hear, is, we've been talking about increasing the quantity of money, and that's what causes price inflation, but aren't there other possible causes? And people, can talk about supply chain and so forth. So yeah, it is true, and that's a good point. I don't want you to take away from this talk that we believe in, as Austrians, a mechanical view that, if you increase if the inflation rate or price inflation rate is 10%, that means the quantity of money must have gone up by 10%. That's not what we're saying at all. There's, everything is subjective in economics, even the price of money, if you want to think of it that way, all right? So if, for example, the Federal Reserve announced tomorrow that, hey, starting in August, we're going to increase, we're going to give everybody $1 trillion new dollars in cash, every single American, that would cause prices to go up right now, right? Even before that new money came into the system, because people who are holding dollar-denominated assets would look ahead and realize, whoa, when that new money comes in, that's going to make things quoted in dollars go way up in price. I don't want to be holding dollars when that happens in August. So right now, everyone's trying to get rid of dollars. That's going to make prices go up, the value of the dollar sink. Okay, so I'm just saying you can go through little thought experiments like that to see there's not this mechanical relationship. Having said that, though, and likewise too, if there's some problem, there's an earthquake or something, and the real amount of output gets cut in half, you could have, other things equal, if the demand to hold money is the same, then you would expect prices to double, right? Because there's half as much output, and so if people have the same amount of cash that they're trying to spend, then prices would tend to double. You could imagine that. But when you see periods of very high price inflation, it's not because there's just a series of worse and worse earthquakes that keep happening, right? That's not what's going on. So any historical example, particularly what's called a hyperinflation, where the value of the money falls to 1/1,000,000th of what it used to be, that's not because output is 1/1,000,000th of what it used to be. It's always them printing boatloads of money in practice in terms of when the currency crashes. Okay, I think we could, go ahead. Okay.
I see some libertarians say that along with spending cuts, we should also have higher taxes so that the government can pay the debts. I don't think that's ethical. On the other hand, I see Hoppe say that, just have the government say, we're not going to pay debts, just let it go, and then no one's going to buy government bonds anymore. So, yeah, what would you say to that? Okay,
yeah, great question. Again, in case you didn't hear that, he's saying some libertarians he's heard will say that in general, when someone starts a sentence with, I've heard some libertarians say, you got to just brace, it's going to be something awful. That he said, dealing with the debt, it's not merely that, it's too simplistic or ideological just to hope for spending cuts, that also, we should be adults in the room and tolerate a tax hike in order to, to close the deficit. And also, but then he's heard other libertarians say things like, well, what if they just defaulted on the debt? Okay, so that's great, and that's a good final question here. Let me just speak a few minutes on that, and we'll wrap up. Okay, and this came up with the arguments over the so-called big, beautiful bill. And I was like polling people and trying to get a sense of it too, and it was interesting to see. So I think from a libertarian property rights perspective, that taxation is theft, and so if that's where you're coming from, any tax cut is justified, right? And so ideally what you would do is you would cut spending as well, all right? But if you're saying, no, that's not an option for whatever reason, doing these thought experiments, the government's gonna keep spending, it was what it's gonna do, would you tolerate a tax cut? I think the answer, from a libertarian perspective is yes, because again, you're just saying, would you like to reduce the amount of theft in society? And generally speaking, the answer to that is yes, of course I would. And specifically when it comes to this issue of funding government spending and shrinking the deficit, the problem, the downside is you say, oh, but if we just give a huge tax cut today and we don't cut spending correspondingly, then that means, going into the future, there's going to be a bigger stock of government debt, right? Because more people now are lending to the government. And so the response I would say to that is, right, so at worst, all you're doing is postponing the theft, right? Like, in other words, worst case scenario just means you're stealing less today to fund the spending, and down the road you got to steal more. But I think, there's two other possibilities. It could be that down the road, as those people are inheriting this bigger stockpile of debt, it could be that quote crowds out some of the other spending. So it might be that because, like, for example, interest on the debt gets bigger and bigger, maybe other spending programs don't rise as fast as they otherwise would have. Okay, so there is that element. So I don't think we should just take it as a given that government spending is just going to do what it's going to do, and then taxation and the deficit are completely independent components of that. I don't think that's correct, in the real world. So there's that element. But then even beyond that, it's not a given that they have to tax people down the road to finance the debt. Like you're saying, it is possible they could just down the road default, either partially or explicitly. And so if they default by inflation, then that's still just theft through a different mechanism. But if what they do is they just say down the road, yeah, we owe these people $1 billion, we got $10 billion of government bonds maturing this month. We don't have it. We've only got $5 billion. You know what? We're going to give everybody a 50% haircut. We owe you contractually $10 billion. Here's $5 billion. Sorry. That's your fault for trusting Uncle Sam. They could do that. That's possible, right? Corporations do that. That's what happens. And so from a libertarian perspective, that is a much better alternative, right? If the idea is, yes, by cutting taxes, it means there's a higher likelihood down the road that they will default on the debt. Again, if by default we mean explicitly they don't pay as much as the Treasury security says the person's legally entitled to, then yeah, they violated a contract with that person, but that's not stealing in this, just like if a company sells bonds, then down the road, doesn't have a good quarter and can't meet its bond payment, that's not theft. That's not like robbing a bank. Whereas sticking guns at people and saying, give us some of your paycheck or you're going in a cage, that is explicitly theft, in a Rothbardian framework. So that's kind of the way they handle it. And then last thing I'll say on that, you might say, okay, there's your ideology, whatever, but come on, practically speaking, defaulting, that would be a very consequential thing. And right, but also at the same token, then the lesson would be learned and people might say, okay, maybe we shouldn't be treating U.S. Treasuries as the safest possible asset. That's, and so if people then from that point forward were more circumspect about lending money to the government, that's arguably a good thing, not just from a libertarian property perspective, but even from an economic perspective, because Uncle Sam's actually not that good of an allocator of capital. Okay, thanks everybody.
All right. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate you making your way to this session, because I know you have other options. So I've been asked to talk about bureaucrats in the deep state. And so that's what I'm going to do. I think the first thing to get out of the way is defining the deep state. I think there seems to be a lot of different conceptions of what this is. And so I want to, not that I have a completely clear definition, but I want to make it a little less vague than this, the different ways in which this term has been used. So I'll start off with what I don't mean. And I'll give here the Wikipedia definition, which was probably written by the deep state. It says, a conspiracy theory about a clandestine network of members of the intelligence agencies working in conjunction with high-level financial and industrial entities to exercise power alongside or within the elected U.S. government that might exist. And I guess what I want to do with my definition is feel like you can leave your tinfoil hat at home and point to what we actually can see. So what I do mean are the bureaucrats we see in federal agencies that operate with de facto electoral unaccountability. When we think of democracy working ideally, it would be the case that voters elect politicians. The politicians are supposed to hold the bureaucrats accountable by either firing them, making budgetary decisions. But unfortunately, democracy doesn't work as advertised in this way for various reasons. Voters aren't perfectly informed. Politicians aren't perfectly informed. They often have to rely on information from the bureaucrats themselves, where, the Pentagon might not give that report to Congress about the money they've been wasting. And so there are various failures along the way that keep this electoral accountability process from happening. Even though in a de jure sense, it might be possible for if voters could get together and decide they wanted more bureaucratic accountability, maybe that could work better, but as it's working, or it's not working. Also don't limit this just to intelligence agencies. Especially include the national security related organizations, or Secretary of War, if you prefer. And most of my illustrations will be about the so-called military, industrial, congressional complex. But I'm not just limiting to them. A lot of this analysis can apply to other regulatory agencies within the executive. And also, and this is related to that first point, agencies whose leaders and policies are not much affected by changes in what party's in power in the White House or Congress. That even if you might have a motivated executive that things such as courts say, no, maybe you can't fire these guys. It might be more costly than you thought. So I know that's not like a super precise definition of the deep state, but that's what I want to work with here. So again, like I talked about yesterday, this light by which I see everything else, economic calculation, the key to defining bureaucracies. Right? You have management by profit and loss, you have bureaucratic management. I like this quote by Mises in Bureaucracy, in which he talks about one of these agencies frequently associated with the deep state, the FBI. He says, the objectives of public administration cannot be measured in money terms and cannot be checked by accountancy methods. Take a nationwide police system like the FBI. There is no yardstick available that could establish whether the expenses incurred by one of its regional or local branches were not excessive. So this isn't to say that the things that the FBI does aren't valued. They do things like get to the bottom of the Epstein case and things like this. But this value doesn't have any cash value on the market. So that's what Mises is saying here, that they can measure their expenses, but whatever they're doing, it doesn't have this cash value on the market by which it can be compared to their expenses. And so we don't have an objective way of saying they were spending too much here because we don't know the monetary value according to consumers of what they're producing. And this has many implications. If we could assume the calculation problem away, imagine if we're talking about defense procurement, if we knew exactly what the market value of all the various inputs the Congress and the Pentagon get for the military, they wouldn't want to spend more than what the opportunity cost, or at least everyone would know if they were doing that. Presumably then, maybe, think more about the political economy question. What would voters want? I presume most voters want, no, don't spend more on this than you have to, and don't get more military hardware than is necessary for defense. And therefore, you'd have less room for cronyism. It's I want to maybe measure how definitive I want to say, but I think the lack of economic calculations is a necessary input for cronyism. So if we think of, say Dr. Herman, he's acquiring his patio. He has plans of exactly what he wants. There's all these specified conditions, and he's open to taking bids for acquiring, or for some contractor to build this patio. Is there room for a contractor to engage in bribery? Well, not really. It's like, yes, perhaps they could go wine and dine Dr. Herbener to convince him that, yes, you should have your patio built by us, but if they don't offer him a comparatively attractive package as the competitors, like, okay, there's this bribe, but if the value of the bribe is less than the difference between their price and their competitors, there's not real value in making a bribe here, right? He knows what he wants. He knows how much he's willing to pay for it. And so there's not the same room to bribe as when you're spending someone else's money on things nobody really knows the value of. So I'd say, yeah, you wouldn't have this room for cronyism without the economic calculation problem. And therefore, the military-industrial congressional complex, as we know it, would not exist without this epistemological limitation. But, of course, the actual state operates with this lack of economic calculation, as well as a number of other problems that I wish to talk about in turn. So these include rent-seeking and rent extraction, the revolving door phenomenon, local politics versus the national interest, incentives within bureaucracies, and we'll round it out by talking a little bit about the role of the media in this. And what I want to emphasize here is that a lot of these things are just a more or less natural outcome of how these structures exist. We don't have to assume nefarious actors that man these congressional posts, these bureaucratic posts, that these things more or less occur. And that, so even if we assume the best of intentions, a lot of these phenomena would exist in any case. So let's talk about rent seeking and rent extraction. So what I mean by rent seeking, this is when, essentially a bribery, legalized bribery is a kind of part of it. It's this expenditure of resources to build, maintain, and use beneficial connections with government to curry favor. And this behavior is predictable because, say, if we're talking about defense procurement, the defense firms receive income from government contracts, and there's not a real marketplace here. You have a monopsonistic buyer buying things that are very specific to this industry. There's not really civilian counterparts buying the outputs of these defense firms. And so you don't have a real existing market here. And I'd say the big theme is there's room for fudging. And by fudging, I mean, since we don't really know the market value of these outputs, we don't know how much is too much to pay for them. And there are incentives on both sides to pay as much as possible, as I'll talk about in a minute. And these payments, this expenditures in the form of rent seeking can consist of campaign contributions, contributions to politicians' favored charitable organizations, or various payments in kind. One example of such payments is in kind. A report in 1975 from the Senate investigators found that at least 10 major defense contractors, in addition to the Northrop Corporation, have operated lush entertainment facilities for Pentagon brass. They include quail and pheasant shooting preserves. Right? Don't invite Dick Cheney. Yachts and recreational facilities in exotic warm climates. And so they use these are some of the ways in which they wine and dine politicians to curry these favors, to build these relationships. Rent extraction is kind of the inverse of this, where we think of rent seeking as defense firms coming to Congress or the Pentagon brass and saying, here we are giving these things of value, please pay attention to us when you're making procurement decisions. Rent extraction is the politician, say, going to the defense agency and say, hey, I have these contracts to give out. What do you have for me? Or it might be in a more threatening sense. And this is true of, say, regulatory agencies, where we're considering this regulation that might harm your business. Might you have something for us? So that would be kind of the same process, but the impetus, the demander side, just being the other side. But it's both are expressing this idea of payments made in exchange for favors. And again, this can only exist when we don't know the value of the outputs. It's not like how Dr. Herbener knows exactly what he's willing to spend on his patio. Next, I want to talk about this revolving door phenomenon. So this is when particular individuals move between a bureaucracy and, say, an industry being regulated and Congress. So in this case, you have individuals who might have been in the military. They end up, after their military career, working for the defense industry, and then maybe they work inside Congress as part of, say, a House subcommittee on defense procurement. That this is a predictable phenomenon based on not even quasi-market. It's a weird situation where you have this lack of, what you want is this expertise, right? If someone's in the military, they might have these better ideas than someone who's just moved from being a lawyer into Congress about what the military needs or wants, or at least, or most importantly, what they're willing to pay for, right? So moving from the military to the defense agency or to Congress, the real value comes from understanding this procurement process, what the Pentagon or Congress is willing to pay for, and showing competency in this regard. So the value of the revolver comes from understanding all these things. But this leads to a number of cost distortions and dysfunctions. So even if this revolver, while they're in the military, comes to gain this real technical expertise on what would be useful on the battlefield, this technical expertise is not a substitute for economic value, right? You can have defense-related outputs that, might be really technologically advanced, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're worth the cost of creating them. So these are really two different things. And secondly, technical expertise itself is probably less important than political expertise. right? What's going to make you valuable to defense contractors is knowing what members of Congress are, what do they want to contract for? What are they willing to pay for? Do you have this competency in terms of making deals, knowing people? And this will make you more valuable either if you want to move from the defense sector to either the Pentagon or Congress. And both sides have perverse incentives for cost enhancement rather than lowering costs. So this is obvious from the side of the revolver working for the defense agency, where obviously they want to get as big of contracts as possible for their employer. But also from the other side, if you are on the procurement side, on the congressional side, you have less of an incentive to engage in cost containment when it's look at the benefits I can provide this defense agency that might hire me after I'm done in Congress, right? There's a mutual back scratching. Right? You don't want to be the one who's tamping down on costs. And again, part of this is because no one can really objectively say you are overpaying for this thing. It's not like Congress is coming to these defense agencies like Dr. Herbner's coming to these patio contractors where it's like, here's exactly what we want. Who can produce it for the lowest price? A lot of these contracts made are for speculative future goods that don't exist yet, proposals. And so in that way, it's very important to have competency on part of the, and again, by competency, I mean being able to close the deal, to be convincing that members of Congress can point to this guy and say, yes, we knew what we were doing, and even if there are cost overruns, we're willing to fudge on that. We're willing to accept deadlines not being met because that increases their future value to defense firms. And the selection process for if you, I don't know, somehow find yourself in this, wanting to be a reformer, you're not going to get very far. The selection process is against cost containment. Your career is not going to go as far if you're going to be that guy, Defense agencies aren't going to want to reward you like they reward the guys who don't engage in such cost reduction. And more oversight can't solve this problem because the overseers are going to be subject to the same incentives, right? If they want to maximize their future value in this industry, they're also not going to not want to be that guy. Okay. Now moving on to this topic of local politics versus the national interest. So what I mean by the national interest here is if we have a certain target for defense-related outputs, all else equal, we want to acquire those at the lowest cost possible, right? That defense based on cost minimization would hopefully take full advantage of the division of labor and specialization, at least on a national basis. Dr. Newman, in his talk on free trade, had mentioned these arguments about national defense exceptions to free trade. So, I mean, regardless of whether certain parts of those production processes are international or if it's all contained within our nation state, we would want it to be the lowest cost possible. If we're operating in the national interest. But what we find for a lot of how this industrial organization develops is that it's probably not fully taking advantage of specialization and economies of scale. So to provide an example of this, so this picture here I have is of a C-17 cargo plane. So back in 2008, the Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, informed Congress that the current planned order of 205 of these cargo jets for the Air Force, that was sufficient for current needs. Members of Congress decided to ignore Gates and further expand the fleet beyond what he said was needed for the Air Force. And why do they do that? Is it because they think he's making a bad entrepreneurial decision in terms of defense? Maybe, but it's also beneficial to employees within their districts. So this C-17, built by Boeing, Boeing says that this program supports 650 suppliers and more than 30,000 jobs across 44 states. And I guess I'm no expert in producing C-17s, but it would seem to me that's a lot of states to spread this production around, right? And this is similar for other airplanes as well. Lockheed Martin's F-35, production of that is spread across 45 states. Is that because this is the most technically efficient way of producing these airplanes? Maybe, but probably not. Why do they do that? It's because more members of Congress will have an interest in not cutting these programs, right? Their local constituents will be interested in keeping these programs running, regardless of whether they are the most whether this is the best allocation of defense-related resources. So we face the issue of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs, which comes up a lot in this realm, where the benefits are concentrated among the people working in this industry. They have a very strong incentive to pay attention to what their members of Congress are doing, perhaps even becoming single-issue voters on this, where the costs are dispersed among all taxpayers, where you as an individual taxpayer, this might be, maybe a few tens or hundreds of dollars difference in taxes per year, where if you are the beneficiary of this program, this is your job, this is most of your income, you're definitely gonna pay attention. You'll be calling your congressman over this, right? Where most people do not have the incentive to pay attention and lobby. And so this is how you can have local politics overriding the national interest. Okay. Now this, mention how I like this graph. So bureaucratic incentives. I want to mention, so bureaucrats or bureaucracies themselves and the people making decisions, and they're often modeled not as profit maximizers, but as budget maximizers. And I want to say, again, this doesn't have to be for nefarious reasons. If you are a member of a bureaucracy, you probably believe in its mission, right? If you, say you're working for the Humane Society because you care about animals, and maybe you get these taxpayer-funded grants. Right? You want to maximize your budget because the more resources you have, the more shelters you can build, the more animals you can get adopted out, the more spaying and neutering you can do, and all these other activities that the Humane Society does. If you don't know what the marginal benefit, you see the benefits here, but without consumers being able to demonstrate that these are more valued than other outputs, you don't know. So again, we have this marginal cost is defined for us, but not this marginal benefit. And so we can understand why, or again, it doesn't have to be a nefarious reason why bureaucrats want to maximize their budgets. They can say, hey, I'm being selfless here. We have this great mission here. The more resources we have, the more good we can do. So it's not necessarily this selfish reason that our budgets are higher, so therefore our incomes can be higher. So this is just a natural tendency of bureaucracies. It's not necessarily just this, bad guys doing selfish things. I want to talk about what happens when you let bureaucrats vote. So Mises in Bureaucracy makes, I think, or several good points here about bureaucrats as voters. He says, the bureaucrat's pecuniary interest as employee towers above his interest as employer, as he gets much more from the public funds than he contributes to them. So the idea here is the taxpayer being the employer of government employees. So the bureaucrat, I mean, both as a taxpayer, he's an employer, but as a bureaucrat, he's an employee. And I guess, regardless, I think of Rothbard talking about government employees paying taxes as an accounting fiction, right? It's not like they produce a surplus from which government can be funded, right? If the accounting fiction is, okay, government bureaucrats get this income, they pay income taxes on it, it would not be any different if they were paid their net pay tax-free, right? So that's why Rothbard says this is an accounting fiction. But regardless of whether we say that's an accounting fiction, it's clear that bureaucrats receive more than they pay. And so an implication of this is that the bureaucrat, as a voter, is more eager to get a pay raise than to keep the budget balanced. His main concern is to swell the payroll. So as both this tax consumer as well as this recipient of government services, the bureaucrat is going to tend to vote in what his interests are. And this can become a problem when bureaucrats as a group become a sizable part of the voting population. Mises goes on to say about the bureaucrats, their main concern was to get more out of the public funds. They did not care for ideal issues like liberty, justice, the supremacy of the law, and good government. They asked for more money, that was all. And this is something that politicians can't ignore. And this is why you see a swamp developing, where a concentration of people who don't care about these ideals. They want things to keep growing and will work hard to prevent any upstart from upsetting that. Oh, I want to make a minor point about personnel decisions. Acting within, think about Rothbard and Man, Economy, and State, where he talks about an entrepreneur deciding to hire his never-do-well nephew, where Rothbard says this business owner, in that sense, is not acting as an entrepreneur. He's acting as a consumer. Say if he wants to hire his never-do-well nephew as a favor to his sister, he's engaging in consumption. If his nephew's getting this paycheck that his productivity cannot justify. And so employers acting as business owners in markets, if they engage in discrimination that's unrelated to productivity, they are acting as consumers, and they pay a cost to this as the residual claimant of the revenue that their firm creates. They're going to be less wealthy than they are otherwise and be at a competitive disadvantage. This is different in bureaucracies. People making personnel decisions within bureaucracies can avoid these costs. They're not residual claimants of the revenue of the bureaucracy. But these costs manifest themselves in different ways depending on what kind of bureaucracy they're operating. If they are responsible for protecting VIPs, one of these ways the costs may manifest themselves is VIPs getting shot. If the Federal Aviation Administration is hiring air traffic controllers based on factors other than competence, then more planes might crash. It's not going to be, these costs aren't going to express themselves in profit and loss statements, but in these other ways, and may take some time to manifest themselves. So I wanted to talk a little bit about media and deep state influence over media, where as I've become disillusioned of more naive conception of media. If I were to describe this naive conception, it'd be something like, or especially news media. What do consumers want? I think if you ask them, they'd say, well, I want unbiased news. I want it to be accurate, not fake news, informing me of things that are important. And so entrepreneurs trying to act in their profit maximizing decision would then be to provide this. And advertisers would want to advertise with this because they'd have the most eyeballs to see their advertisements. But this conception, probably mistaken. It can't explain certain things. So here on the left, I have a picture of the military bowl presented by Northrop Grumman, this big military contractor. I'm like, why would Northrop Grumman sponsor this bowl game? They don't really, I don't think they have anything to advertise. I don't think they sell any consumer goods. Like, are they trying to create goodwill? It's like, guy watching his football and like, oh, Northrop Grumman, thank you for providing me with, sponsoring this game. What a great American institution Northrop Grumman is. Now, maybe goodwill is part of it. I think the bigger part of it is that Northrop Grumman is making a payment to a media outlet, and despite, maybe journalists, maybe some of them have like these ideals that they want to be what people think journalists are, as expressed in fiction, doing this investigative work and speaking truth to power and all this, but you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you. And I think that's part of what's going on here. Maybe it's even clear when today's news is brought to you by Pfizer, right? If Pfizer's a major advertiser for your news outlet, I wouldn't expect to see a lot of investigative journalism of, say, the efficacy or safety of Pfizer's products, right? So, say what might be more valuable to some advertisers, I guess I should just say sponsors, is not so much advertising their goods as controlling a narrative, that might actually be in some cases the most highly valued use of media. And so we see resources being allocated to the most highly valued uses. It could be the case that their willingness to pay to control narrative is greater than consumers, generally speaking, willingness to pay to get the most accurate news possible. Another thing the deep state likes to do is insert their personnel into the media. So this picture right here, this is various talking heads at MSNBC from CIA, FBI, DEA, Department of Justice, US Army. There's quite a few of them. And why do they, well, it's obvious why the deep state agents want to do this. Why do news outlets want to do this? They do still maintain some semblance of authority. They don't want to lose access to the bureaucrats that give them this privileged access to information. And yeah, so they end up putting these talking heads on, and it seems like there is a tendency for some of them to fail upwards, right? To then, people still watch MSNBC after reporting about, here's what these intelligence agents said about Hunter Biden's laptop, right? So it's useful for them to control this narrative, or control the narrative about various things. And also to control various other sources of information, particularly social media. So here on the left, we have ex-CIA agents deciding Facebook's policies. There was a recent Supreme Court case involving various states' attorneys general suing the CDC, other federal agencies, because these federal agencies were contacting social media companies, suggesting to them like, hey, we don't like these posts going on. So, the CDC alerted platforms about posts related to COVID and vaccine misinformation, like, oh, maybe you should suppress this, it might be dangerous, we don't want that going viral. The FBI communicated with these same platforms regarding election misinformation. All right, and I believe the Supreme Court decided that these states' attorneys general didn't have legal grounding to make these or as plaintiffs, they didn't have legal standing. But these are various ways in which even alternative sources of information, the various federal agencies try to control the narrative there as well. Because there's value in it. They wouldn't do it if it weren't valuable to control the narrative. So to engage in some more self-promotion, suggest if you were interested, there was a recent volume published in honor of Robert Higgs. It was called The Legacy of Robert Higgs, to which I contributed a chapter. Titled the chapter is If Angels Were to Govern Men. And this is in regards to James Madison in Federalist 51, saying if angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. And then it's like, well, let's think more about this. What if angels were to govern men? And basically, the short version is they'd still face the calculation problem. Angels still are not omniscient. So they would have to make decisions over how to allocate resources. And so you'd face a lot of these same problems. Maybe cronyism would be mitigated to an extent, but still there's room for fudging. Angels wouldn't know how much to pay for C-17 cargo jets or how many to acquire. This is still an entrepreneurial issue. And then maybe a more serious problem, conclude that even if angels were available to be elected and to man the bureaucracy, I don't think they would get elected. That is, if we think of the state as this institution for a technology for extracting wealth, transferring wealth to others, that those who most value this ability are going to be the ones that capture it, right? So in an ironic sense, good governance under a state is a public good that will be underprovided, right? You run into the same concentrated benefits, dispersed costs problem, that even if most people would very much benefit from good governance, these benefits are dispersed. The concentrated benefits from capturing the state to reward ourselves and our friends, those are more concentrated. We would form a more efficacious political action committee. And so I guess my main takeaway is that these things we see from the deep state, we don't have to assume that these are bad actors. I mean, maybe they are bad actors, but that the incentives and the epistemological problems are what allow this to happen. And this is just, what we see is a natural outcome of that, not necessarily just demonic forces or anything like that. So I think with that I'll conclude, and I think we got plenty of time for questions. Thank you. And also here's some references if you're interested.
Raise your hand if you got any questions.
What do you think about Javier Milei's presidency? Do you think he's battling against bureaucrats, or is he collaborating with them?
I can't claim to be much of an expert on Milei's, all the things he's done. I do think some would argue that he's not fully beyond the influence of some of these, if you want to call them deep state forces, right? So I hope it's okay if I leave it at that I don't claim to have any special knowledge. Cruz. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. To what extent do you see evidence of economies of scale in the provision of military force?
Oh. So, yeah, regarding the industrial organization of military force, right? This is because these are, I guess, different things if we consider national defense as such and producing certain goods in the support of national defense, right? There are different ways of protecting ourselves from, say, foreign invasion or other threats that don't necessarily have to do with military technology. Like, I think how I defend myself from theft is by not having anything worth stealing, right? So maybe the question is more about, the industrial organization of producing military hardware, which say, there's probably quite a few economies of scale to this. Why, like in our fun MMT video of gathering resources to fight World War II, that automobile manufacturers, they have these economies of scale in automobile manufacturing, can retool these into producing military hardware. So I'd say, certain military-related goods are subject to these economies of scale, right? And if we think of, say, small arms, it tends to be, you got America, you got France, these tend to be the big arms exporters. It's not, in most cases, countries producing their own small arms. So there seems to be economies of scale in that as well.
Maybe you got asked that already, but are you open borders or closed borders?
Open borders or closed borders?
Yeah, regarding immigration.
About immigration. So, yes, this is something I've been considering writing about, in that I think a lot of the libertarian debate regarding this question is misplaced. Like, there's a lot of, it seems like a lot of the debate is on state-controlled land and how that should be governed. And I don't want to say that's irrelevant, and I understand why libertarians start with that, because, like, I'm concerned about property rights. But it seems to me that, like, if you talk to normies about, their concerns about immigration, it's not what's going on these public lands, man. It's, things like crime, use of government welfare benefits, and these other things. So really, to me, it seems to be more of a question of political association, right? And I guess I'm, trying to think of, like, the best way to approach this question. I had presented a paper at AERC or the Libertarian Scholars Conference, kind of a joint event, and I guess I wanted to consider this question from the perspective of James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock, and from their calculus of consent, where they asked this question: what would Homo economicus agree to in making a constitution? And within their book, they don't really talk about immigration policy. There's not really any, it seems like they think this is like a worldwide event. There's not really any insiders or outsiders. But I think this would be an interesting question to consider is, what rules regarding immigration or joining our political community would Homo economicus agree to? And it seems, I don't know that I can put a whole lot of detail into that, but it seems to me that at the very least, Homo economicus wouldn't say or agree to a rule where, just anybody can join up our political community, right? That there would be some kind of standards that they'd want. And so, I think, to reiterate, I think this debate is misplaced over questions of movement or governance of public lands, and it's really about questions about political community and what rules people would want to be governed under regarding that. So I hope that answers your question somewhat.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. For your last lecture of the afternoon, some of you will be taking the written test, I think, after this. So I wanted to start this talk on higher education off by saying that I am going to say some negative things about higher education, but I want to make sure you understand that I do think there is a place for higher ed, and I think most of you in this room are probably very well suited to take advantage of what I think can be a good experience for college students, graduate students, and we need more of you in the academy, in places where you can build the tools to engage in the intellectual battles that need to be fought. And so in all of this kind of could be taken as a kind of a pessimistic approach to higher ed. I don't want you to get the wrong impression. I also am mildly optimistic about some sections of higher ed, and I think that there are some colleges and universities that are very well placed to do well. I teach at a small liberal arts college in South Carolina. We have about 1,800 students. My classes tend to be very small. Largest classes I have are about 25 to 26 students. I give blue book exams. Students sit in my class and they handwrite their test answers, and there is a lot to be said for that. And I think especially in an age of increasing AI challenges, which we'll hopefully talk about this afternoon, I think that there's a resurgence of that. And somebody was telling me the other day that the company that makes those blue books has seen a surge in demand as that had dropped off a good bit as a lot of testing went online and other things. And now professors are starting to move back to these handwritten exams where we're actually sure that the person that's sitting there at the desk is the one that did the work. And so I think there's a lot to be hopeful for, I think, although there will be some trauma and something of a shakeout, I think, in higher ed. I don't know whether you're too young to get my Dire Straits reference on this title slide here. It's a reference to a 1980s song called Money for Nothing. But I think higher ed has been approaching this kind of increasing cost for diminishing benefit, and that's what I really wanted to focus on today. I showed this slide here on price changes in various parts of the economy over the last, 25 years or so. You can see that the biggest price increases have been in those areas where the government has been very active with subsidies and with regulation, medical care being among those. Hospital services up 271%, much, much higher than overall inflation. And higher education, as you can see, is the next highest on that list, 194% increase in college tuition and fees. So how did we get there? A lot of this has to do with more and more money going into higher education, much of that from the federal government. So we have the Moral Land Grant Act. This was an early piece of legislation that began that process of bringing federal money into education. And then the post-World War II increase in the number of students going into higher education was driven partly by the GI Bill, which gave veterans federal money for college. The National Defense Education Act started the Perkins Loan Program. The Higher Education Act of 1965 brought federally guaranteed private bank loans, and that paid interest while the student was enrolled in school. Pell Grants in 1975 became fully funded. The Student Loan Reform Act, which tied payments to discretionary income in 1993, and then wrote off the debt after 25 years. And then 2007, we had a revision of those payments with a lower percentage of discretionary income. And then 2010, the Healthcare and Education Reconciliation Act, which nationalized the student loan process and put all of that lending and collecting under the Department of Education. Since 2010, we saw a doubling of student loans, 2010 to 2023, a doubling of student loans. And so it's to be expected. It's common sense. If you subsidize something, you're going to get more of it. And you subsidize student loans, people are going to borrow more money for colleges. And that money is coming into colleges from federal sources and from state sources predominantly, approximately equal sums But there seems to be a lot more discretion about the money that comes from state governments. I have said in previous talks on this that it's almost as though every graduate from high school is carrying a backpack of government money, and it is the colleges or universities' objective to extract that money from that person and then send that person on his or her way. And that is what we have seen in a lot of cases. Colleges incentivized to have lower admissions requirements in order to get more of those subsidized funds in their pockets. We've seen also an increase in the amount of real spending per student. This is inflation adjusted, it's real spending. And over about a 70 or 80 year period here, we see that the amount of money per student has increased enormously. Now, does that mean that the quality of education has increased in lockstep with the increase in the money? And that's, I understand, a matter of some debate, but I would suggest that that has not taken place, that we're not seeing education that is 3 times or 4 times better than it was in the pre-World War II period, just because we've got more money being spent on higher education. Total federal student financial assistance has gone up in the last 50 years. As you can see, in 1970-71, it was around 10 or 15 or 20,000 2014 dollars, and that went up substantially, especially about 2010, 2011. You remember that was the year that we got more student loan availability, and of course that means that we're getting more money from the federal government flowing into higher education. So huge amounts of money going into this. It's no surprise that we see an increase in student loan debt. As of 2024, we saw about $1.8 trillion in total student loan debt. The average federal student loan balance is about $38,000. 92% of that student loan debt is federal, with a small fraction being private. Now that may change, as you may know if you've been following what has been going on recently. You know that the federal government just recently passed a bill that caps the amount of lifetime student loan borrowing from these government sources. And so there's some kind of hand-wringing about that in higher education, about what's this going to do? Is this going to mean that with less money, we're going to see fewer students? This, along with the fact that the number of 18 to 22-year-olds in the U.S. population is basically falling off a cliff. It's dropped because, short version of this is that in the recession of 2008, 2009, childbirth rates dropped off a lot, and how old would a person be who was born about 2008, 2009? Well, they'd be approaching college age now. And so colleges are struggling, those especially that are dependent on the 18 to 22-year-old group. They're struggling to get those students, and now there's this concern about federal money drying up, or at least being capped. Now, I would say there are good reasons not to be concerned about that, even if you didn't have a principled objection to having government funding higher education. One way to manage this, of course, is to turn the borrowing over to the private sector, which is where, frankly, I think it should have been all along. Tuition has gone up faster than inflation. You saw this on the earlier graph. This sort of isolates what's happened to tuition. And you can see that in the 1970s, 80s, early 90s, tuition was going up at a rate roughly comparable to overall inflation, and then began to separate and was growing faster than inflation in the years after that. What has that meant for the pain of affording college? How easy is it now for households to afford a college education? The general impression that a lot of people seem to have about this is that, well, college got more expensive and therefore we needed the government to step in and make sure that it was easy for people to borrow to go to college. And in fact, I think the cause and effect may be reversed, that in fact, college tuition has gone up because it has become easier for households to borrow. Now, that does not mean that the share of household income that is going to college has declined. In fact, we've seen that college and university education has absorbed a larger amount of the median household income over time. So the far left of this graph here is 1969-70, and you can see that that tuition and required fees for a 4-year college was about 8 or 9% of the median household income. Even though household income has increased since that time, we saw that by the end of this chart, which is 2011-2012, that had gone up to around 27% of household income, and it continued to rise. In fact, this is a little more recent information here. I wanted to update that chart on the previous slide. This is public and private nonprofit 4-year tuition and fees as a percentage of median household income, and you can see this goes all the way to 2022. And it is for private institutions, that's the blue line on the top, that is, looks like about 100, I had it on a note here, but I'm missing my note, but it's about 140% of median household income. And then for public institutions, it's around, looks like about 35 or 40% of median household income. So that indicates that this is a real burden, and people are taking on huge amounts of debt as they go through a college or university, and then if they go into grad school, med school, law school, whatever, they're stacking on even more, and this has become a real problem for those who are seeking a normal college or university education. Now, many years ago, we saw this hypothesis develop that maybe this increased availability of funds was going to result in higher tuition, and that's exactly what we have seen. This is called the Bennett hypothesis. William Bennett, former Secretary of Education, said in 1987 that increases in financial aid in recent years have enabled colleges and universities blithely to raise their tuitions. And some more recent work on this has indicated that it is perhaps as much as a dollar-for-dollar increase. This 2012 study from Nicholas Turner says that tax-based aid crowds out institutional aid roughly dollar for dollar, indicating that if the government provides $1 of aid, your college or university will provide $1 less. It's not really helping you very much. Another study from 2013 finds that the Title IV institutions that are eligible to participate in these federal student aid programs charge tuition that's about 78% higher. So 78 cents on the dollar of your tuition rising. That's not really improving your affordability very much if you're getting federal student aid. Another study from 2017 said that they found a pass-through effect on tuition of about 60 cents on the dollar, smaller but positive effects for unsubsidized federal loans. This is most pronounced for more expensive degrees and those provided by private institutions. Another study from 2017 found that tuition would increase by 91% as a result of these federal student loan availability initiatives. So where's this money go? Is this going to make your educational experience better? Is this, I mean, you could sort of understand if there's more money flowing in and you're getting a better product so that maybe your earning capacity or your fulfillment in life has been much improved by having all of this extra money going into higher education. And yet what we find is that a lot of the money is going into things that are definitely not academic. Richard Vedder, in his book, Restoring the Promise, goes into a lot of this in excruciating detail. I'll just give you a couple of anecdotes here. Princeton University spent $136 million on a new student dormitory, which came out to about $300,000 per bed. Since 2000, New York University provided $90 million in loans, many of them zero interest and forgivable, not to students, but to administrators and faculty who bought very nice homes on the Hamptons, and also many other lavish perks. Some universities, larger universities, will maintain private aircraft that they use to fly their top administrators and coaches around. And of course, this is incredibly expensive, but if you've got that kind of money, then that's what you do. So what is it that exactly universities are about? I mean, there are three possibilities as I see it. We could look at a university education as doing what, honestly, I thought of my profession as I went into it many years ago, that we're teaching students valuable ways of thinking, truths about the world, analytical ability, just basic facts about our discipline, and we're preparing students for a more fulfilling life and more income maybe as they move into some sort of occupation or career. Another possibility is that we're providing a signal. Maybe it's not so important what we're teaching as that we're requiring young adults to go through a series of hurdles. And if you can make it through these hurdles, then you've demonstrated something about yourself, that you're motivated, persevering, and intelligent, and that this is something that employers like to see. They want to get motivated, persevering, and intelligent graduates and employees, and so all we're doing is sort of filtering out those that don't meet those characteristics and giving people a piece of paper at the end that says, yes, we certify that you have these characteristics. It doesn't really matter what your discipline was, as long as it was challenging, it would be satisfactory toward those ends. And then third, maybe we're just providing fun, an enjoyable environment, social opportunities, and so forth. So let's look at the first one here. Earnings and unemployment rates by educational attainment. Okay, so this is what you're shown by maybe a high school guidance counselor, somebody who's trying to help you with your college applications, or somebody who's basically defending the idea that you should go to college after you graduate from high school. And they'll say, okay, well, look, the more education you get, the more you're going to earn. Your unemployment rate will actually be a little lower maybe a lot lower if you get more education. And so this is because they say college is inculcating these analytical skills and this knowledge that you will need to be successful in the workplace. Well, are we actually doing this? I mean, so I'm going to dwell on this slide for a little bit because I want you to think carefully about what it's suggesting. First of all, there are managers who, in responding to surveys and what they're seeing from recent college graduates, are saying they don't have any critical thinking skills. They don't solve problems very well. We're not getting graduates from college that have the kinds of things we want them to have as they come into the workplace. Well, there's some data that we have here from CLA Plus, and what they found in the survey is that in 4 years of higher education, we get a 17.5% reduction in non-proficiency of essential skills. And so that's not to be confused with percentage points, you understand, but 17.5% reduction. So that's 57% that do not have those skills entering college. And that percentage drops to 47%, so a little under half of students exiting college do not have those skills. So, we did a good job, reducing that percentage from 57 to 47, right? And you see some corresponding reductions, or rather increases in the percentage of students who are accomplished or advanced in those skills. And so we think, well, okay, that's something, right? Except think about the fact that we have 63,300 students that are entering, and 51,000 students exiting. Why? Well, because not everyone who enters college exits with a degree. Now, there are those who drop out of college and go on to do remarkable, wonderful, innovative, and productive things, okay? There are people who say, well, you know, I'm wasting my time. I have this entrepreneurial opportunity. I can go pursue that. You might think of somebody like Bill Gates, who dropped out of Harvard. I'm not a huge fan, but we understand that Bill Gates did some pretty remarkable things without finishing college, and he had some great opportunities, and he took those instead of deciding to just continue at Harvard. So, we see that not everybody who drops out is just some sort of derelict. I mean, you have people that drop out for great reasons, and that's fine. However, probably many of those who do drop out find that college is too challenging, and maybe they should spend their time doing something else. And maybe the skills that are required to do well in a classroom are not among their skills. And so that means that probably some of this reduction from 57 to 47% is that some of these 12,000 or so students that didn't make it to the finish line were from this 57% group at the bottom, okay? Survivorship bias, all right? So what that implies is it may be that we have done nothing to improve critical thinking skills. And it depends entirely on, you know, how many of those that drop out were in this bottom group as opposed to the top groups, and I don't have information on that to settle that question. But it is certainly a possibility, and I would say plausible, that at least is part of what's going on. That we're not conveying as much of the kind of analytical skills that we would like to see. Furthermore, these students that enter grow up a little bit when they're in college. They're 4 years older, probably, by the time they graduate. Maybe 3.5, maybe 5, maybe 6, but they're older. And a person who is not in college, who gets 4 or 5 years older, is going to develop more of these skills, okay? So you have to really compare how is this student progressing in 4 years of college versus how would this student have progressed had they not gone to college and done something else entirely? That person would probably also have gathered some of those analytical skills. So that puts even more of a question mark on how much we are contributing in the college or university environment. All right. Maybe we're just signaling. Maybe it's not about conveying these skills. Maybe, in fact, we're a kind of a glorified filter, and we're filtering out students who don't have a strong work ethic, or they don't have that kind of higher order thinking that we would like to see. And I'm not trying to be an elitist here on college education. There are different forms of higher order thinking, and I have great respect for many people that I'm friends with that never went to college, and they're far brighter than I am, and they do very well in their occupations. And don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not trying to cast them in a bad light. But maybe there's something to the signaling hypothesis as well. Maybe what we're doing is really a kind of an arms race. So my grandfather on my mother's side went through 8th grade and then dropped out, never went back to school. He did very well. In his, he had several careers, but he did very well. Today, if you have an 8th grade education, you probably would not do as well as my grandfather did. What a high school education would have gotten you in the 1950s would not get you today, all right? So maybe what we're doing in going to college or universities is we're investing in a kind of a relative standing. So it's how much you have relative to other people, not the absolute amount of the skill or ability that you have. Maybe employers are using educational attainment as a kind of a signal of that motivation, perseverance, and intelligence that I mentioned earlier. Well, let's suppose the top 50% of those that have the most schooling get the good jobs, and those that they're in the bottom half by educational attainment get the bad jobs, okay? So in order to prove that you're a superior employment prospect, you would then need to have more of that signal of motivation, perseverance, and intelligence than other people. So maybe in 1950, we're over here, and people who have less than a high school education tend to get the jobs that are less remunerative, less desirable, difficult working conditions, and so forth. Again, my grandfather, 8th grade education, he did pretty well in spite of having less than a high school education. And then if you have a bachelor's degree, you'll do better. You'll tend to have higher income, better working conditions, and so forth. Well, skip ahead 75 years, and what do we have? In order to prove that you merit that higher job by virtue of your skill level, then you have to stack on more education on top of this, a master's degree maybe, instead of just having a high school diploma or a 2-year degree. So what this implies is that maybe people are investing more than is necessary to be prepared for a career. Maybe they are giving up on other things, other alternative tracks that would have prepared you for a career that don't involve sitting in a classroom for 4 or more years. And so we get this kind of credential inflation. Formal education may still pay off for some people, but some people are simply spinning their wheels. They're doing a lot of work, but they're not really getting an extra benefit except to prove that they are more likely to have the desirable workplace skills than others. Now, I am blurring some distinctions here across different fields, but we know that there are those who go to college and they pay the same tuition and they get a degree in, let's say, physics, a notoriously difficult field, and others who maybe get a degree in a less difficult field. And these are not going to have the same income potential after graduation. My understanding is that Wall Street financial firms like to hire people who have physics degrees or other kinds of difficult science degrees, even though you're probably not going to be doing physics when you get to Wall Street. They know that you have signaled that you are a hard worker, that you're capable of understanding something difficult, and you will press through to a final completion of a project. One of the kind of proofs, and this is drawn from Brian Kaplan's work on this. He's got a book called The Case Against Education, where he makes this kind of signaling argument. And he says, look, if you, let's say, 4-year education, that's 8 semesters. Let's say you go 7 semesters of your 4-year program, and then you drop out. What's your relative income boost going to be after 7 out of 8 semesters? Are you going to expect to get 7 out of 8 of the dollars of increased income after you graduate compared to someone who stayed the extra semester? What do you think? Could you expect to get 7/8 if you did 7/8 of the work and you just didn't get the degree and you quit after the 7th semester? No. This is something called the sheepskin effect, right? So if you finish all 8, you get that income boost. It's not automatic, of course. I mean, I'll leave that alone. But that's 7/8 is not going to get you 7/8 of the advantage that 8/8 would. And I should also add one more caveat here. It's important to remember that there are non-monetary payoffs to education. These are sometimes critical. So even though I'm talking about income boosts and what you can expect to get paid as you go into your first job, I recognize that's not the only thing, and it may not be the most important thing that you get as a result of a college education. So that is important to think about. But in terms of how all of this extra education is playing out in what people are doing after they graduate, these are the education, this is pulled from Richard Vedder's book, this pie chart here. These are the education requirements of occupations held by college graduates. And I want you to notice here that nearly half, 48% of people in a job, 48% of college graduates who are in a job that does not require a college degree. So you got your college degree, and now you're doing a job that you would have been qualified for without that degree. We have a large number of employed college graduates as of the, let's see, I don't have the year on this, but this is in Richard Vedder's book again, 41.7 million employed college graduates. Of those, only 28.6 million are in a job that required a college degree, to just put this a different way. Over time, we've seen a dramatic change in this. Taxi drivers and chauffeurs in 1970, very few of those had a college degree. By 2010, over 15% had a college degree. Salesmen and sales clerks in the retail trade, now nearly a fourth of those have a college degree, whereas in 1970, that would have been less than 5%. We're educating people far beyond what they needed for their occupations. So the third possibility here is that college is simply providing some extra opportunities for socialization and consumption. So, Jonathan Newman, in an article on Mises.org several years ago, showed something similar to what I had pointed out earlier, that we're not seeing an increase in critical thinking over 4 years, so what is it that students are actually doing? And maybe they're having fun. Nothing wrong with fun, but we're possibly getting more of this than we should because we're effectively subsidizing this 4 extra years of fun at taxpayer expense and at the expense of those who will be saddled with large student loans after they graduate. So what does this imply for how college is conducted? If students are really there largely for the consumption opportunities that college provides, maybe they're going to choose majors that are not so demanding, because as long as you're enrolled, you get to have access to all of these social opportunities, and maybe the desirability of having some sort of lucrative career afterward is not the big attraction for you to be there in that institution. So maybe you're choosing something like, well, I went to Clemson as an undergrad, and I did that for my master's, and I had a good friend of mine at Clemson who was a PRTM major. And PRTM was officially Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management. But we always said it stood for Party Right Through May. And there may be a shift in college majors toward majors that allow access to all of these social opportunities, but don't put too many demands on social time and maybe end up being kind of thinly disguised entertainment opportunities. So this is a chart, again, from Vedder's book, which I again, highly recommend. The time spent on academics by full-time U.S. college students from 1961 to 2003, and over this 42-year period, we see that the number of hours students spent on their academic work dropped from about 40 per week to a little under 30, maybe, about 27, I'm guessing, from this chart. It's hard to say, but a significant decline. Now, I gave this talk a couple of years ago, and I had a student come up to me afterward and say, well, you know, that's because we have the internet. And So when you're looking for resources, you had to go flip through this card catalog in the library, and it took you forever to find books and papers, and now we can do it very quickly, and it doesn't take us very long to do that. And I've also noticed that students are spending a lot less time writing their papers than they used to. So, yeah. So I said, look, we didn't have the internet in 1988 either, but you can see that there was a significant decline between 1961 and 1988, and we barely had the internet in 2003. So this is not really about the fact that you now have the internet to do your research. I do have to talk about this issue of plagiarism and what's happened with incentives in colleges and universities, because this is something that I think we're really going to have to figure out. A lot of college education has moved online. Now, my institution is a 4-year undergraduate only institution. We don't have a graduate school. We don't have any online courses. We're all face-to-face courses, and I'm optimistic about that model going forward. I think that that's going to be a really good position to be in as a college in the current environment and moving into the future. But think about the overall incentives that the government money flowing into higher education has created. What is it that colleges want? They want that backpack full of money off of that 18-year-old's back. And the way to get that is to accept the student and keep the student. Extract the Pell Grants, extract the student loans, send the student out the door at the end of 4 or 5 years on their merry way. And so the administrators are incentivized to accept students without scrutinizing their abilities too much. And writing ability is one of those abilities that I think has dropped off in the long term. When the student is in the institution does not have a strong incentive to vigorously prosecute plagiarism, except to the extent that they want to maintain their reputation. They don't want to become a degree mill, but they don't want the student really leaving either, because then there goes the money. For the most part, there's an incentive to downplay or turn a blind eye to the problems. On the faculty side, the faculty and the graduate teaching assistants and so forth that are actually grading papers and going through all of that tedium of evaluating students, well, they really don't want to have to deal with the bureaucracy of prosecuting a plagiarism case. Now, I personally think I've got a pretty strong sense of justice, and it's morally offensive to me when I see people cheating, and so that kind of drives me to go through this process even when I don't really want to. But there's an incentive against vigorous prosecution of these kinds of problems, and you compound this with online education. And I was talking to a family member of mine recently, and her kids are in a big state university, residential students, and they're taking a lot of classes that are online. In spite of the fact they're on campus, living on campus in a dorm, and they are taking classes online. I'm sure that's true of a lot of you. And if you're online, we know that there's not a very good way to kind of monitor what you're doing. And that is becoming even worse now because of AI. There's a lot of grade inflation. We've got a lot of part-time instructors coming into higher ed. They don't have a real strong incentive to prosecute in plagiarism and other academic dishonesty because they're there maybe on a short-term basis. Maybe they have their eye on some sort of tenure track job later, and they don't really want to get bad student evaluations by being too hard on students. So their incentives are to be easy and to get those positive student evaluations and then be able to go on to the job market and say, look, I'm a great teacher, my students think I'm great. And look at all my great student evaluations. Whereas if you're like, I'm holding the line here and I'm not gonna allow students to cheat and I'm gonna prosecute it, then students don't really like that on the whole, and that works against the instructor. So this is what's happened to A's and B's and other grades over the last, well, this goes all the way back to 1940. And you can see A's have become not quite the majority as of 2012 anyway. I think that might be the majority today. But this is what's happening is that students are getting A's and B's and so forth. Part of this is driven by, again, this kind of subsidization. Because in order to qualify for the government money, you've got to maintain a certain GPA. You're not paying out of your pocket where, if you're paying out of your own pocket and college is cheap because it's not being subsidized, then, you take your C, you pay your tuition, you get your degree, no big deal. But if you have to maintain a certain threshold GPA to qualify for those grants and those loans and so forth, well, you're gonna go to your professor and you're gonna say, look, I gotta have a B or I'm gonna lose my scholarship. And the professor's like, well, I don't wanna be the bad guy here. I don't want somebody to lose I'm not psychotic. I don't hate students. I want them to succeed, and I don't want to be the guy that's like, you lost your $10,000 scholarship because of me. And so that's a good bit of moral pressure. And I've got my own ways of thinking about this. I'm not, well, I'll maybe talk about that later, but that only goes so far with me, but it's a real problem. I mean, it tends to encourage this kind of grade inflation. Let me just say in the last several minutes that I've got here, a few things about AI, because I know this is something that's now pervasive. It's not like something that only the kind of tech-savvy students are familiar with this. Now it's everybody is familiar with what this does. And it's difficult because there are legitimate and positive and helpful uses of this technology, and yet the dividing line is not always clear between the legitimate uses and the dishonest uses of this. And I'm gonna tell some of my students this is an article I ran across in June, but I'm gonna tell my students going into my classes this fall about this study that found that when students were using AI to write their papers, they were losing their analytical ability. They were losing their cognitive skills. And it's not just about producing some sort of product that is a nice looking product that your professor will find easy to read and satisfactory. It is the fact that you are not putting into your head what you need to be putting into your head. You're ultimately losing cognitive ability as you use this kind of technology, when the objective of the writing is to instill that cognitive ability, which is what writing does. It's not just that I want a paper, I want you to learn something. And you learn something when you are engaged in that writing process, okay? If you skip that and you just farm that out to AI, you're missing the point. It's one thing if you're writing like, I don't know, if you're writing a copy for an ad for your company one day and you use AI for that, the objective of writing the copy is not to learn something yourself, okay? So that's a different purpose for AI. I was talking to another family member who said, I've got this business and I need to write copy for my website and I used AI for that. And what do you think? Okay, that's because the objective of creating a website is not so you can learn something, although you might, that's not the objective. Colleges and universities are supposed to be about learning cognitive ability. One MIT study, and this is from July 17th, and I'll give you a QR code at the end so you can scan that and get all the details on where these sources are. But this MIT study said that volunteers writing essays who used AI recorded lower brain activity, poorer memory of what they had written, and a weaker sense of authorship compared to participants who did not use AI. AI users consistently underperformed at neuro-linguistic and behavioral levels and maintained that same limited mental activity even when they no longer had access to it, which should be scary to you. Now, I've got some things here on Hayek, which I don't have a lot of time here to cover. I'm out of time. But I do want you to recognize there are fundamental limits to what AI can do. It is, and Professor Engelhardt and others have written on this, on what can AI plan an economy? No. Okay. So I'll close with this. AI cannot substitute for certain work that is inevitably going to be human, determining priorities. What are the competing values here? How do we manage trade-offs? How do we live with uncertainty? And these kinds of things AI is not capable of doing. These are human priorities that we have to decide that we're going to set for ourselves, and trade-offs we have to be willing to make for ourselves. So I will put my QR code up here, and thank you very much.
Hello, y'all. I just have a few announcements to make. The first one is just a friendly reminder. Each morning when we are coming to the Institute, I know breakfast is so good, but let's make sure we finish our breakfast and get in to the building on time. That way, when our first 9 o'clock lecture begins, they feel just as special as the rest. So let's make sure that we are in our seats and ready to learn every morning at 9, which will be tomorrow, and then at the start time on Saturday. And then the next thing I wanted to tell y'all is that if you've not grabbed your book box on the way downstairs in Ward Library, please remember to grab it on the way out. And then also today we are having Chipotle for dinner. There is no shuttle running and taking you guys back and forth because Chipotle is actually just like halfway through between here and the hotel. So you guys will be walking, and but in the meantime, at 5 o'clock, so about 10 minutes or so, we're going to have the written exam for orals. And so if you want to participate, please stick around.